Good evening. Welcome to Mill City Church and this collaborative effort with Modern Day Debate. It's great to have a full house. If you are, just for the sake of seating, if you could just kind of scoot in either on these aisles, go ahead and swing to the walls, and if you're in the middle section, if you could scoot into the middle. We'll do it Mill City style tonight here. We're just going to sit on top. We won't be sitting on top of each other, but we'll be thinking those thoughts. We are excited to host this opportunity tonight, and James Coons is going to be our moderator tonight. So James, would you come up here? Welcome, James, as our moderator tonight. So we're going to just open in a word of prayer tonight, and we'll get this party started. How about that? Dear Heavenly Father, God, we're just so thankful for who you are, for what you've done, for giving us a place that we can come together and we can have a discussion. And Lord, I just pray that you would be in our midst tonight. We invite you here, we expect you here, and we are thankful that you will. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Good evening. I am thrilled to be here, and I just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for coming here. And I have to give the biggest thank you to Mill City Church. I am honestly overwhelmed with their generosity in letting us use their equipment, as well as giving their time just to make sure this runs smoothly. And so I just want to say thank you so much to Mill City. I'm going to just go over a couple of, you could say, ground rules for tonight's debate, and then we'll actually get started with the debate relatively quickly. So for our ground rules, there are just a few things we'd like to ask. If you'd be willing to be as respectful as your normal selves are, I think it'll go very smoothly. And with that, we're even asking if people would be willing to save their applause for between the statements only. And in addition to that, both of the debaters have asked that people could consider this as a first step, or perhaps for some of you, you could say the 10th or 20th step out of many more to come. In other words, hopefully this is not the end for you in terms of learning about these issues, but that you continue to learn about them. And last, you could say this is a disclaimer, just saying that whether it be Mill City Church or Modern Day Debate, the views from the speakers are only the views of those speakers themselves, and they are not speaking for organizations more broadly. So with that, I will read the format for tonight's debate right after introducing our speakers. So to my left, Stephen Worthey actually has an apologetics channel on YouTube with over 1,000 subscribers where he has done apologetics teachings and has a curriculum of apologetics for churches to use. So, if you'd like to welcome Stephen, we are thrilled to have you here, Stephen. We appreciate it. On my right, a good friend of mine, a warm and generous friend, TJump actually has his own YouTube channel, which also has over 1,000 subscribers as well. And in addition to being a warm friend, I can say he's a skilled debater, debating people such as Paul Copan and Peter Hitchens on his channel. So if you'd like to give Tom a warm welcome as well. And last, I'd just like to say on Modern Day Debate, we just strive to hopefully do our best to host, you could say, fair and, you could say, level-grounded debates in which people can discuss the deep questions of life and feel welcome, whether they be Christian, atheist, Jedi, even Sith. We want to welcome everybody to the channel. And so with that, I will read the format for tonight's debate, and we'll begin. We'll have a 20-minute opening statement from each speaker to start, followed by an 8-minute rebuttal from each speaker, a 5-minute rebuttal from each speaker, then 30 minutes of open discussion, so just a dialogue, followed by 5 minutes of closing arguments, and last, 25 minutes of Q&A. For the Q&A, we will put priority for questions that come from the live audience, and it's possible we may call in questions or read questions from the online live chat, only in the event that we run out of questions from the live audience. So we really appreciate you guys making the drive over here tonight. And with that, Stephen, I am setting the timer for 20 minutes for your opening statement, and the floor is yours.
Testing, we on? Testing. Got that on. Hello? Hey, there we are. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Well, let me jump right into it. When I was a lot younger, I had a silly dream of one day reading poetry in a coffee shop. And when I was done, everybody would snap their fingers because of how cool it was. And but there was a big problem. I really didn't like coffee. I forced myself over a longer period. I started with gas station frappuccinos. Is this working? Gas station frappuccinos that were just loaded to the brim with milk and cream and sugar and syrups and 1,000 other chemicals. Eventually I moved on to Starbucks frappuccinos, Dairy Queen lattes. Eventually I moved on to just plain black coffee. I'd finally graduated to liking coffee, and I drank plain black coffee for about a year until I learned that it was okay to love myself, and I put cream, at least, in my coffee. I'm sure that you're wondering what this has to do with the existence of God. If you did get a coffee tonight, which, by the way, the Mud House, delicious coffee, thank you so much. Big round of applause for the Mud House for putting out some coffee today. So the first thing I want to say about coffee is that if it's fresh, there is steam rising from it. That's very important. That brings me to my first argument for the existence of God, the Kalam cosmological argument. So, premise one is anything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Premise two, the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause for its existence. This cause is God. So this is the argument. I'd like to examine each premise and the conclusion to see if it's a sound argument. So the first thing we need to do, and actually, Wesley, if you wouldn't mind, I'll just do the laser strike and have you move the slides manually, because I think there's a lot of lag on this. Premise one, anything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Is it possible that this premise isn't true? Can you get something from nothing? What do we mean by nothing? Is nothing a cosmic vacuum in which energy, strings, and other entities exist in fluctuation? We're on the next slide. No. Matter, energy, and even space itself, even if truly empty, is still something. Aristotle once said that nothing is what rocks dream about. So when you hear people in physics or elsewhere say that nothing is really something, or nothing is unstable, or nothing has these properties, that's not true. Pure nothing is actually nothing. It's the absence of something. Getting something from nothing has never once been observed. If it could happen, why wouldn't we see it happen more often? Why wouldn't things pop into existence from nothing? Something from nothing isn't scientific, but a metaphysical idea more akin to magic. But at least with magic, there's a magician and a hat. Something coming from nothing is the sudden appearance of a rabbit without the hat. So, what about premise two? The universe began to exist. Is it possible that maybe the universe just has an infinite past, that it's always been here? Let's go to the next slide. No, actual infinities do not exist in the actual universe. There's two ways to show this. There's philosophy and science. We'll start with the philosophy. We don't have time to dive into thought experiments like Hilbert's Hotel to show the absurdities that arise if actual infinities could exist. But for the sake of time, I want to offer you another analogy. This is what I call the domino analogy. Let's say that you've got a long line of dominoes, And they're all black, but there's one red domino. We'll call this red domino this present moment, or today, to simplify. In order for that domino to fall, in order for it to happen, the black domino in front of it, we'll call that domino yesterday, needs to fall and knock it over, right? That makes sense? In order for that domino to fall, the domino before it, the day before yesterday, needs to fall and knock it over. Well, here's the thing. If you keep setting up dominoes in front of it, going into the past, forever and ever and ever, you will never reach a starting point where you can begin tipping the dominoes. You will never get to the red domino. You will never get to this present moment. The fact that we're in this present moment is evidence that there was a beginning, because if there wasn't, there wouldn't be enough time to get to now. So that's the domino analogy. We'll move on to the next slide. Science tells us a lot about the beginning of the universe. Science shows that the universe is expanding. In 1915, Albert Einstein published his general theory of relativity, which unified space, time, and matter. In 1922, Alexander Friedman published the Friedman equation, showing that the universe might be expanding. In 1927, George Lemaitre suggested estimated values for the rate of expansion. These values were corrected, and the expansion of the universe was confirmed by Edwin Hubble in Hubble's law, using the red shift of objects in deep space. In 1965, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson discovered the background radiation of the universe. The expansion of the universe leads backward to an initial cosmological singularity, or starting point. A past eternal universe cannot be expanding. This is known as the Standard Model, or Big Bang. Competing oscillating models, where the universe exists eternally, have largely been rejected by cosmologists. Next slide. There's something even bigger than this, though. All this information is nothing compared to entropy, the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy is the scientific principle that energy degrades over time as the universe continues to expand. Once the energy in the universe has been spread out and lost, the universe will reach a state of what is called equilibrium, otherwise known as the heat death of the universe. The implication of entropy is a universe with a definite beginning. If the universe had existed forever, why hasn't it run out of energy by now? Since it had an infinite amount of time to expand, I know my coffee was brewed recently because there is still steam rising off of it. So the reason that we know that the universe had a beginning is it quite literally still has steam coming off of it. The expansion, the energy that it contains, it has not thinned out. It has not reached equilibrium. If it had an infinite amount of time to do so, that's where we would be. World-renowned physicist Alexander Vilenkin writes, "With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." Nobel laureate Arno Penzias writes, "Astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing, one with the very delicate balance needed to provide exactly the conditions required to permit life, and one which has an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan." So, the Kalam cosmological argument, premise 1 and 2, I think are well established. Let's go to the next slide here. But the universe having a cause, this conclusion is something that needs to be supported as well, because in this conclusion we have this cause is God. I'd like to go over the reasons why. So, if the universe is comprised of space, matter, and time, then the cause of the universe must be spaceless, immaterial, and timeless, as well as incredibly powerful. Only two things can be described as spaceless, immaterial, and timeless. Number one is abstract objects, like numbers, or two, an unembodied mind, or consciousness. The thing about abstract objects is they lack what philosophers call agency, or causality. They're descriptions. They're not prescriptions. They just describe what already is. For example, the number 5 has never caused anything. Particular laws of physics or constants don't cause things. They're merely descriptions we use to describe what we're actually seeing. Whereas a mind is something that can actually have causality, that can choose to create. So out of the two things that would fit the ruby slipper, I'll say, the mind is a much more plausible candidate out of the two. Thus, it follows that the cause has to be a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, incredibly powerful, personal mind. This mind is what we call God. Much like the universe, this coffee didn't create itself. So the second thing that I wanted to point out about my cup of coffee was that it is ethically sourced. Where's our next slide? We're a little slow. There we are. So morality is a very peculiar and interesting thing. And in my next argument, I really want to clarify what I mean by this argument, where I'm kind of going with this. A lot of people will mistake this argument for thinking that if you don't believe in God, or if you're not religious or whatever, that you can't be a moral person. It's not at all where this argument is going. This is more to do with the identity of God and Him as a foundation for morality. So C.S. Lewis actually said that my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? So this leads us to the moral argument. And the moral argument goes like this. Premise 1, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. So we're going to examine premise 1 first. If objective moral values and duties do not exist, God does not exist. This isn't usually a controversial premise, but I'll say this about it. The reference point or standard for objective morality must be unchanging, independent of personal or corporate preference, thought, and opinion, and universally authoritative and binding to all people in all places at all times. So why is God the perfect foundation for objective morality? Because only God is unchanging, independent, and supremely authoritative. Commands are predicated on the authority of a person. Without personhood, there is no authority or foundation for objective moral values or duties. So, objective morality, maybe it's not the case that morality is objective. But the thing about objective morality is that our everyday experience confirms our sense experience of prescriptive and universally binding values and duties. Clear case examples, and a clear case example, by the way, is something like the innocent should not be tortured for fun. That's a clear case example of a moral value that everybody in this room would likely hold. Those duties are self-evident truths that transcend personal or corporate preference, thought, and opinion. This is reflected a lot in our culture, actually. In the Declaration of Independence, we read, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So what about alternatives for subjective reality? And is it possible that something like cultural relativism or conventionalism, ethical subjectivism, evolution, or Platonism might actually be a better fit or a better explanation of morality? Well, let's move on to cultural relativism first. If we're not at that slide, there we go, perfect. So cultural relativism claims that because different cultures disagree on moral values and duties, then morality must be subjective. This is a fallacy called affirming the consequent. Disagreement does not necessarily entail that morality is subjective. Objective moral values and duties can be misunderstood, emotionally resisted, or volitionally opposed. If two golfers disagree on a scorecard, one of them is right, or both of them are wrong. But both of them can't be right. You wouldn't look at the disagreement and say, well, since we can't agree, we'll just affirm everyone in all of their opinions on moral issues. That's a logically fallacious line of thinking. Conventionalism. This one's a little worse. Conventionalism claims that societies, cultures, and collective groups determine moral values and duties. Conventionalism commits the argument ad populum fallacy. We all agree, therefore it's true. Conventionalism establishes moral values and duties by force or collective power and is counterintuitive to moral reform. Reformers like Martin Luther King Jr. or William Wilberforce would be categorized as immoral because they disagreed with their culture. Examples of conventionalism throughout history discredit its methods by clear case examples of its consequences, such as the Holocaust. During the Nuremberg trials, when we put on trial men that were responsible for millions of Jews dying, they pleaded conventionalism. We didn't do anything wrong, we were just obeying the law. that was what our culture had decided what was right. And our response was usually capital punishment in that circumstance. They should have known that what they were doing was a crime against humanity. Ethical subjectivism, this is the one that you're going to see everywhere. So ethical subjectivism claims that what's morally right or wrong should be decided by individuals. Ethical subjectivism, the what's true for me is true for me, and what's true for you is true for you, is logically self-defeating. Moral claims under ethical subjectivism are reduced to matters of opinion and preference, but clear case examples, such as torturing the innocent is wrong, reveal that moral values and duties transcend personal opinion and preference. So evolution. Some people will claim that moral values and duties are the result of evolution or sociobiological conditioning. The problem with this line of thinking is that it's irrelevant. This commits the genetic fallacy. So the genetic fallacy is trying to undermine a belief by explaining how someone came to hold that belief. Justification for holding belief in objective moral values and duties has no bearing on the truth of objective moral values and duties. In other words, it doesn't matter why you believe something. What matters is whether or not that belief is actually true. If we are sociobiologically conditioned, then moral beliefs are grounded in survival and not truth. You would be determined by your biology to believe whatever you believe. This view is known as epistemologically self-defeating. It's determinism, which you wouldn't have access to knowledge to be able to claim that as such. So what about other views like Platonism, humanism, or other moral philosophies without an objective standard or reference point? The problem is that they're all arbitrary and subjective, and for those reasons, they're going to fail for the same reasons that cultural relativism or conventionalism or ethical subjectivism fail. So none of them really account for our sense experience of objective moral facts and duties. So, moving on to the conclusion of this argument, it necessarily follows that if premise 1 and 2 are true, then God exists. This is known as a modus tollens argument, and so long as we can affirm that objective moral values and duties do exist, which I think there's a strong case for, what we just went through is what we call an abductive argument. It's where we take all of the possibilities and slowly eliminate them until we're left with the most reasonable one left over. German philosopher Immanuel Kant once said, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the starry night above me and the moral law within me." Francis Collins, founder of the Human Genome Project and director of the National Institutes of Health, writes, "Encountering this argument at age 26, I was stunned by its logic. Here, hiding in my own heart, as familiar as anything in daily experience, but now emerging for the first time as a clarifying principle, this moral law shone its bright white light into the recesses of my childish atheism and demanded a serious consideration of its origin. Was this God looking back at me?" There are a lot of arguments that I didn't have time for tonight. I chose two that are rather simple to present. We can go a lot deeper with them. There are arguments like the argument from consciousness, the teleological or fine-tuning argument, we're going to fly through these slides kind of quick here, the ontological argument, the contingency argument, the Aristotelian proof, and so many more. All of this amounts to a powerful abductive argument. So an abductive argument, we want it to have explanatory scope. That is, theism accounts for more of the evidence. Explanatory power, that is, the evidence is more probable under theism. It fits well with background information. Theism does not contradict.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Theism does not contradict any other relevant evidence, is more plausibly true than competing theories. So here's what I want to see from my opponent. First, respond to the arguments themselves. Show why they're not sound. Second, provide a more plausible theory. This is the one that is rather tricky. I've noticed a lot of people that get into debates or arguments, especially for Christians, they tend to always be on the defense, as though they need to prove their case, but the other person gets a free pass. That's shifting the burden of proof on their part, when both parties, if they're making a claim about reality or about the status of God's existence, you now bear the burden of proof. And so a lot of people will say, well, I didn't claim anything. I'm just saying that I don't believe what you believe. Okay, that's a claim about my claim. You're saying that what I'm saying is false. That's a positive claim, and that needs backing up as well. So I'd like to see some sort of plausible explanation, possible worldview or theory in place that fits the evidence better than theism. The third thing to remember is that alternative explanations are not refutations. That's something that a lot of people miss. So just because you can tell a story about something else and say, well, maybe the facts say this, maybe this is another way to account for it, that's not a refutation. And what we really care about is plausibility and probability over possibility. Anything is possible. We want to get to what's probable. And so with the Kalam in particular, we have philosophical and scientific reasons to believe that the universe began. And when we examine different candidates for what could possibly cause the universe that can't be the universe itself, there has to be something that transcends the properties of the universe. Thus we get to God. When we examine the moral argument, that's something where without God, without an objective reference point, we don't really have an explanation of why anything should be objectively moral. Does that mean that we need to believe in God to be moral people or do good things? No, not at all. That's not what the argument is claiming. The argument is claiming that with God, it's possible that morality exists at all in an objective sense. So these are the two arguments I present. There's much more I'd like to say, but only so much can be said in an opening statement. Thank you so much for coming and hearing us today.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that opening statement. We will now move to Tom's opening statement, which will also be 20 minutes. I am setting the clock for 20, and just as I did with Stephen, I will start the clock on your first word, Tom.
Thanks, James. I'm really glad to be here. Nice to see all you guys. This is a pretty cool experience for me. My first live debate, so thank you. Round of applause for all of you guys for coming. All right, so the debate topic tonight is, does God exist? And, well, from my perspective, not the Christian God. Now, it's possible there are some kinds of gods that could exist, maybe like a deistic kind of a God. But the Christian God, I'm pretty sure, doesn't exist. And I can say this for two reasons. One is that there's no real reason to believe in a God. Like, all of the evidence that theists present, as we saw today from Stephen, can be explained by many other alternatives equally as well. So he's right that alternative refutations or alternative explanations are not a refutation unless those alternatives are exactly equal in their scope, explanatory scope and explanatory power, then they are. And so my position is that those same arguments and evidence can be explained equally by lots of different alternatives. And the second reason is that we have good reason to believe there is not a God because of the problem of suffering. Now, if there really was an all-good, all-powerful God, he wouldn't have created a world where there's this involuntary suffering, where we're forced to be in this world without our consent to experience suffering that we didn't accept. If there was really an all-good, all-powerful God, he would have given us the option to say, you know what, I don't really like the way that world works, I'm going to go to my own world. That's what an all-good, all-powerful God would have done. And we obviously didn't have a choice to be here as far as I'm aware. So I'm pretty sure that God can't exist. So first, concerning my first point, the reason we can know that there is no evidence for God is because there are alternatives that explain the same evidence equally as well. For example, what caused the origin of the universe, what caused the fine-tuning, what grounds objective morality, purpose, meaning, values, and justice. The biggest misconception that most theists have is that they believe God is special and that only God can be the ground of objective morality, or that only God can be the origin of everything, or only God can do X, Y, and Z. My main goal in this debate and conversation tonight is to show you that that is not the case. Anybody can make up answers to the origin of everything, objective morality, the fine-tuning, and all of the arguments theists present that are equally good or better explanations than a God. You don't need a God to explain these things. For example, the origin of the universe, as Stephen presented in his opening statement, can be explained by an eternal, all-powerful, natural thing that we just haven't discovered yet. There can be more nature out there than just what we know about, beyond or before the Big Bang. It's not the Big Bang isn't the beginning of everything. It's the beginning of everything we currently know about. There are many theories about things existing naturally prior to the Big Bang. For example, the string theory or M theory or the cyclic universe or the many worlds hypothesis. The Big Bang isn't the beginning of everything. It's just the beginning of everything we currently know about. So that can be explained by nature or an alternate, all-powerful natural thing, for example, naturalistic pantheism. And the fine-tuning can also be explained by an undiscovered law of nature that binds all of the laws together, forcing them to be the way they are, which is a theory proposed by Stephen Hawking. So the fine-tuning can be explained by a natural thing we haven't discovered yet. Even objective morality, you can say it's grounded in an undiscovered law of nature, that kind of like gravity, that just permeates the universe. That can be explained by nature. I mean, we once thought that time can't be physical. Time can't bend. That's really silly. But then Einstein came along and said, yeah, time can bend. It's a physical thing. Morality can be the same kind of way. Even if it doesn't intuitively make sense to us, it can still be that way. All of these together can be explained naturally by a non-God equally or better than a God. Therefore, they are not evidence of a God. They are just things we don't know the answer to yet. Arguments from ignorance, for example. For example, 2,000 years ago, people said, well, lightning, we can't explain lightning. It must be caused by Zeus. Well, maybe, it's possible. Maybe God does explain the origin of the universe and objective morality and fine-tuning, but maybe it doesn't. We can explain it equally well in many different ways. Think about it like this. Imagine you have a box, and you said there is a rabbit in this box. And the reason you know there's a rabbit in this box is because the box weighs 2 pounds. Now, the fact the box weighs 2 pounds isn't evidence of a rabbit, because it could also be explained by a lizard, or a coffee mug, or Legos, or a 2-pound leprechaun, or a unicorn, or baby Bigfoot. The fact that it can be explained by lots and lots of different things equally well in every way means it's not actually evidence of a rabbit. The same thing applies to the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning, morality. These can be explained by a God, sure, or they can be explained by an undiscovered law of nature, or the flying spaghetti monster, or an evil God, or a bunch of different alternatives. Just like the 2 pounds isn't evidence of leprechauns or rabbits or any of those other things are listed, it's just something we don't know what caused the 2 pounds. The fine-tuning, objective morality, the origin of the universe, all of those things can be explained by theism or deism, polytheism, Pastafarianism, diatheism, transtheism, naturalistic pantheism, panentheism, panendeism, omnism, et cetera, et cetera. There are many different alternatives that can all explain these equally well, just like the 2 pounds can be explained equally by a rabbit or a leprechaun or any of those other alternatives. If all arguments and evidence presented by theists can be equally explained by all of these, then they're not evidence of a God, just like the 2 pounds is not evidence of a rabbit. So as I mentioned earlier, Stephen was right that presenting alternatives isn't a refutation of his points unless the alternatives are equally supported as his, because then there's no way to tell the difference between which one of these is true. Because of all of these, there's only one truth, so all the other ones must be imaginary. And if he can't tell the difference between his hypothesis and the imaginary ones, then it's equally likely that his is one of the imaginary ones. This is the case and reason why most arguments are the form, the natural can't explain. Well, it may be true that the known natural can't explain it, but there could always be the unknown natural. There could always be more natural out there that we just don't know about. The supernatural, for example, there could be a supernatural out there. I can't say there isn't a supernatural. It would be like me saying, that's a UFO. Oh, it must be aliens. Well, if it's unidentified, I can't go and identify it as aliens. That's a contradiction. So the same thing would apply to say there can't be a supernatural, because the only way for me to know that would be to discover, to prove definitively that the natural is all there is, and I have to know everything about the universe. So of course there could be a supernatural. And I can't say it can't do X, Y, and Z because we haven't discovered it yet to know what it can or can't do. But the same applies to the unknown natural. You can't say there isn't more natural out there, or that the natural that we currently know can't explain something, therefore no natural can explain something, for the exact same reasons. It's an unknown, kind of like the UFO. You can't ascribe properties to it until after we discover it. Therefore, anything the supernatural can explain, the unknown natural can also explain. In other words, anything a God can explain, unknown naturalistic forces can also explain it. So what was before the Big Bang? Science doesn't provide an answer to what was before the Big Bang. Therefore, the correct answer is we don't know. It could be explained by the supernatural, but it could be explained by the unknown natural. What caused the fine-tuning? Again, we don't know. What caused objective morality? We don't know. The reason science doesn't have answers for these questions is because science is limited to only talk about things we can show are not imaginary, like combinations of principles, particles, and laws in the fields of physics. There is no combination of principles, particles, and laws that gets us omni-properties, like omnipotent, omnibenevolent, which are all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving. These are not combinations of verifiable properties. We can't do a test and show something is all-powerful. We don't have the capabilities in science to do that. So science is not allowed to appeal to those things in order to come up with explanations. And the reason is because there isn't any way to do this that will weed out the imaginary ones. Anybody can do this. You can apply all powerful to the spaghetti monster and then get it to explain things, or unknown natural things, and say, there's an unknown natural law that explains objective morality, or an unknown natural law that explains the origin of the universe. We can always apply these ultimate powers to things, but there's no way to differentiate between them and the imaginary alternatives. So if we are allowed to add in things which cannot be shown to be imaginary, like the supernatural or unknown natural laws or omni-properties, then anybody can make up answers to these questions, equally, anybody, which is why they're not actually evidence, because just like that 2-pound box, we can't just say, well, we can come up with an answer, therefore it's evidence of this thing I come up with. You actually have to do something more. You have to be able to provide a difference between the imaginary and the real thing. What is the actual answer? Anything theology can answer, science can also answer. Science just chooses not to because it prefers not to add in things they can't show are imaginary. The major weakness of religious apologetics is that the methodology and arguments apologists use can be equally supported by any metaphysical theory of everything with omni-properties, like the ones I listed earlier: pantheism, acosmism, deism, panpsychism, transtheism, polytheism. They can all explain it. All of these except one are truth, or all of these except one are imaginary. There's only one truth. And so because none of these evidence and argument can differentiate between which one is the truth and which one is imaginary, none of them are actually evidence that one of is true. The reason we trust science is because it can differentiate between what's imaginary and what's not. And where science stops, that's where it's reasonable to believe stops. So we can't go beyond that and just start adding in things until we have a way to differentiate between the imaginary and the real. So what caused the Big Bang? What caused the fine-tuning? What caused objective morality? Both the unknown natural and supernatural can come up with imagined explanations, but the question, science doesn't provide an answer for any of these because we don't have a way to differentiate between the imaginary and the real. We just don't know. The correct answer is we don't know. As a final note, we have good reason to believe the Christian God does not exist, because if an all-good, all-powerful God existed, then it would have created a world without suffering, as I mentioned earlier. It is immoral to force people to live in a world without their consent. We did not give consent to live in this world. Therefore, if a God created even one person and placed them here without consent, that would necessarily be slavery and necessarily be immoral. The legal definition of slavery is a person owned by someone else, under the control of someone else, or forced to work for another person's purposes without consent. A slave is considered property of another that is controlling them, or purchases them, or owns them from birth or creation in this case. Also, if we are forced to choose between heaven or hell, and I don't have the option to opt out and go to an own universe of my own design, again, I am being forced into God's purposes without my consent, which is, again, by definition slavery, and by definition immoral. An all-good, all-powerful God could never do this. So the Christian God either doesn't exist or he's not moral. If an all-good, all-powerful God did exist, it would have created a being and given each person the option to live in a world of God's design or opt out and go to one of their own. So, in conclusion, there's no reason to believe in a God because none of the evidence actually supports a God. It can all be explained equally, with equal explanatory scope and explanatory power, by many different alternatives. Just like the 2 pounds can be explained by a rabbit or a leprechaun, the origin of the universe and objective morality can be explained by a theistic God or a deistic God or a naturalistic pantheistic God. And if there was an all-good, all-powerful God, he would not have forced us into this life or the decisions of going to hell or heaven without our consent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, for your opening statement as well. And we will now move into the first rebuttals section. So I am going to set the clock for 8 minutes, and then Stephen will give his first rebuttal, and Steve and I will start it on your first word.
Wes, I'm going to need you to just kind of roll with the slides that I tell you. We're going to kind of jump around here. First thing I want to address, let's go to the slide with the rabbit, if you can find it. So it's near the end, picture of a rabbit. Great picture. Really cute little bunny in a box. Yeah, well, it's a little dark here. But rabbit in a box, Tom has a point. If we've got a box and it's just 2 pounds, and then off of that I go, I guess there's a rabbit in here, because rabbits are about 2 pounds. That would be a very stupid argument. But let's say we're in a pet store, and I've walked into an aisle labeled rabbits. And I look to my left on a shelf, and there's a box, and on the box is a label, rabbit. And off to the corner is a half-eaten carrot, and inside I hear what sounds and smells like a rabbit, and I pick up the box, and not only is it 2 pounds like a rabbit, but it's sort of shifting around. Still haven't looked in the box. There could be anything in there, right? Let's say the store owner comes up to me and says, I see you're holding a box that I put a rabbit in. Would you like to buy this rabbit? I get that this is a silly example, but the point is when you have enough things lined up in a row, how much certainty do you need to place your chips, to make a bet? How likely is it that this is anything other than a rabbit? And that's my point. So God being personal is huge with this. He said there are alternatives that might explain my arguments. I'm curious, like what? There was a long list that was quickly said, but I've examined each of these alternatives myself. I wasn't always a Christian. I read a lot of religious literature from other religions, and I tried to dig in and discover if Christianity was true or not. As far as I can tell, and especially some of the sillier ones like Pastafarianism, like this flying spaghetti monster. Here's the thing. If we're talking about a creator God, and you parody that God and say, well, he's got this and that, why can't it be this and this? If at the end of the day, no matter how many silly hats you've put on God, if you still have an all-powerful, all-knowing, omniscient, omnibenevolent being that has created everything, that is the source of everything, it doesn't matter what outfit you've donned on it, it's God. Definitionally, that's God. He said, the Christian God. It definitely can't be that. I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on that. If that's something that any of you would like to talk with me about afterwards, I'd love to, but it's not the subject of the debate tonight. The debate tonight is, does God exist? So we're going with generic, the philosopher's God. Some Christians might not like that, but that's the subject of the debate tonight. So I won't be derailed by that too much. But I do find that I do need to address the evil and suffering argument, because one of my arguments, the moral argument, is largely connected to that in a lot of ways. If you paid attention to the premises of the moral argument, you'd notice that God's existence is necessary to even have objective moral values and duties. So that on Tom's worldview, whether it were pantheism, which it isn't, or naturalistic pantheism, or just plain naturalism, there wouldn't be objective moral values and duties. So the worst that you could say about God and heaven and hell, or the way that God orchestrates things, is, I don't like that. It goes against my personal opinion. I dislike that. But you can't say it's objectively wrong, or it's actually evil. You can say, well, by my definition, it's evil. Your arbitrary definition that you yourself, from your personal perspective, in a subjective way, have made up out of thin air, and there's no more foundation to it than that. The evil and suffering, we'll return to that. I may use my second rebuttal on that, because it's a little more invested, and it's a serious accusation that I want to address properly. Infinite regress, natural law, I said maybe there's some kind of supernatural, not supernatural, but a supernatural law behind the universe that creates the universe. Maybe it's not God, a personal being, but it's just some undiscovered thing that science hasn't found yet. The problem with this is that you get what's called an infinite regress. You've not answered the question of how did the universe begin, you've just removed it one step. Well, it began because this thing caused it. Okay, well then what caused that thing? The only reason we don't ask that of God is because God is a necessary being. God is the ground of reality itself. And so if you want to go on to say, well, this thing that caused the universe is also the ground of reality itself, again, why would something that doesn't have agency or causality, something that doesn't have a mind, go from not creating a universe to creating a universe? Remember, laws are descriptive, not prescriptive. Abstract objects don't cause anything. They can't. Morality, some undiscovered reality, some super law behind the universe that's still natural, but it enforces objective morality. Again, it's a similar problem. This is a similar problem that Platonism has. So, there's this idea that there's somehow moral goodness floating out there somewhere, and that these laws influence us, and we want to obey those things. The problem is that if there's no ultimate authority above those laws, then we're left back to subjectivity. If we've got something like love, goodness, peace, kindness, just kind of out there as abstract entities imposing their will on us, or vice versa, then we've also got entities like murder, strife, greed, pride, also floating out there. So what is causing you to bend allegiance to some set of moral values and duties, but not others? Why would we deem some as the truly good and some as evil, without a third thing to measure them both against, an ultimate standard, an ultimate ground of reality? Again, this is where God is necessary. And the authoritative bit rests on the personhood of God. So if these are just floating entities that just kind of exist, why should I care what they do or don't want me to do, or what they are? I'll do whatever I want. Wouldn't you? Why pledge allegiance to some and not to others? Whereas God, if he's supremely authoritative, then in and of himself, that merits your response. This science can't verify omni-properties. Let's bring up the scientism slide real quick. So one of the things that I see a lot is the belief in scientism, which is, it's a methodological view. It's actually a philosophy that science can explain everything, and anything that can't be explained by science is either not useful, or it's a bygone question, or it's something silly. The fact is that science alone doesn't give us every answer to knowledge that we currently have. So, for example, logical and mathematical truths cannot be shown by the scientific method. Science presupposes math and logic. So that, as William Lane Craig once said in a debate, he actually pointed out all 5 of these, that to try to prove them by science would be arguing in a circle. Number 2, metaphysical truths, such as there are minds that exist other than my own, or the world was not created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age, are rational things to believe that cannot be proven by science. Third, ethics and value judgments. Just like I showed in my moral argument, science can't establish ethical or moral values and duties. It can tell you that if you put strychnine into your mother's tea, or your grandmother's tea, that it will kill her, but it won't tell you whether or not you should put strychnine into your grandmother's tea so that you can get your hands on her property. That's a little fun thing from John Lennox. Number 4, aesthetic judgments. The beautiful, like the good, can't be described by science. You can't tell by a painting or a work of art or a movie if the pixels or the paint is just a smudge or a random assortment, if it's actually beautiful or not. That's something that happens within us. And then 5, the scientific method itself cannot be shown to be scientific. When someone says, I only believe what can be proven by science, the proper response is, what scientific test have you done to reach that conclusion? You didn't. That was a philosophical assumption. Last thing, I'll just end on what gives our autonomy value. Tom's really big in we need to have the freedom to do this, or it's immoral. I want to be able to choose my own universe and jump here and create a new reality, or it's immoral. I'm just curious why, if God really is the creator of all things, why God wouldn't have the right to do whatever he wants with his reality. It's sort of the way it works, right? Everybody here has made something in your life, and when you made it, who owned it? You did. You had every right to what you had created. When you have the ability to create a universe of your own, you may get to write the rules. As far as it stands, I'm a contingent being wholly dependent on God and at his mercy. I cannot create a universe of my own, and as far as I can tell, I owe my entire existence to him, and I owe my allegiance to him. That's it for my first rebuttal.
Thank you very much, Stephen. We will now move to Tom's first rebuttal, and that will be set for 8 minutes, at which I will start it on your first word, Tom.
All right, got a lot to cover here, so I'm just going to jump right in. The first argument Stephen brought up was the Kalam cosmological argument. The universe began to exist, or anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, the universe has a cause. Granted, none of that has anything to do with a God. That cause could be an eternal natural thing. Stephen said, well, no, it can't be an eternal natural thing, because there can't be like an actual infinity. Well, the reason there can't be an actual infinity is because infinity isn't a number. It's a property. It's like X. You can't have an actual X number of things in a barrel because there is a finite number of things in that barrel, which isn't an abstract concept like X. Infinity is the same thing. It's not an actual number. There's lots of different kinds of infinities. They can apply to sets. They don't apply to, there isn't a number. So, of course, there isn't an actual infinity because infinity isn't a number. It's a variable like X. So there isn't actually a problem here for the naturalistic explanation of the reality. It's just a description of language and how we use infinities. He said there's not enough time. If there's an infinite past, well, then how did we get from infinitely negative to right now? Well, 47. There are infinitely many numbers before 47. There's infinitely many between 46 and 47. So how did I get to 47? I just picked it. In nature, you have this thing called quantum mechanics, where there's an infinitely many possibilities of where a particle can break down and shoot off an electron, but it just picks a particular time because of quantum mechanics, and that's how it occurs. So how could the universe have been created at a particular time, and even with an infinite past? Well, it's because of quantum mechanics can do that. Just pick a number, like I can just pick 47 or 52, even though there's infinitely many before that. So again, not really a problem for the naturalistic worldview. He brought up entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, but he forgot the first law. The first law says energy cannot be created or destroyed. So if we're going based off the laws of physics as absolute here, well, then God kind of has a problem because he can't create energy. But luckily, the laws of physics don't apply absolutely in that sense. For example, the second law of entropy only applies to closed systems. And do we know the universe is a closed system? No. The universe is just everything we currently know about. It's not absolutely everything. So there could always be more outside of it that brings some in. That's the physics definition of nothing isn't an absolute nothing. It's just none of the stuff we currently know about. The cause must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. Well, lucky for us, we have those natural theories that can have those things. For example, Sean Carroll, emergent spacetime, where space and time itself can be emergent from more fundamental natural things that exist outside of spacetime. Or Nima Arkani Hamad with the amplituhedron, which is, again, something that exists outside of space and time, but is a natural thing. It's not a mind, it's just, these guys are both atheists, by the way, so there's no mind here. Itzel Barr is in two-time physics, so there can be other kinds of time independent of the time we experience. Same with Stephen Hawking's imaginary time, or Julian Barber's end of time. There's lots of different natural things that can be spaceless or timeless, because spaceless and timeless in physics just means outside of the known kind of space and known kind of time. It doesn't mean completely devoid of any kind of space or time. There's lots of natural possibilities there. And secondly, there's no evidence that a mind can exist outside of the physical realm or spacelessly or timelessly. We have no examples of spaceless or timeless minds. So to appeal to a spaceless, timeless mind would be no different from me appealing to a spaceless, timeless pineapple. We can assert that a pineapple can exist outside of space or time, but until we have evidence of that, it's kind of just a bald assertion. And it isn't grounded in physics. And these other things I listed, those are grounded in physics. So I would say they're a little more supported. Secondly, morality. I believe in objective morality. I am not a moral relativist, and many atheists do. In fact, most philosophers are naturalists and don't believe in a God. I think it's like 71% from the last Pew poll that was taken. And most philosophers are moral realists. They believe in objective morality, even though many of them are atheists. You don't need a God to believe in objective morality. There's lots of different ways to explain it. Very complicated ways in philosophy, but one possibility was just say morality is a law of physics that we just haven't discovered yet. You don't need a God to explain these things, or believe them. He brought up a lot of quotes from a lot of experts who said, only God can explain this, or the natural can't explain that. Well, they're just not really that creative, because again, you can come up with all kinds of explanations, and people have done that. They're just not supported, as in we can't differentiate them from the other imaginary things. There isn't a scientific way to support them, which is why they don't believe those things can do it. And again, he said, alternative explanations are not refutations, which, I mean, I agree, that's true, except in the case when the alternative refutations are equally supported in every way. If they're equally supported, then it is a refutation because your hypothesis is no more or less supported than the alternative. So he brought up the example of the rabbit and said, no, it didn't really work for him. But again, it is a refutation if the alternative is equally supported in every way. So, for example, I would use the example of naturalistic pantheism, which is eternal, all-powerful nature, no mind. It doesn't have a mind. So it's not a God by anyone's definition as far as I'm aware. But it can still explain morality and the laws of physics and the origin of the universe and the fine-tuning equally well or better than theism. I mean, there's nothing it can't explain that theism can explain. So as far as I can tell, it is equally or better in every way. Now, he mentioned his analogy that if we walk into a pet store and we go to an aisle labeled rabbits and see a box with a rabbit label on it, yeah, that's all good evidence of a rabbit. None of that works for a lizard or a coffee mug, but we don't have any of that for God. It's all things that can all be explained by a lizard or coffee mug equally as well. We just have a box. It weighs 2 pounds, and that's it. That's all we know. We don't have anything that says rabbit. If he did, that would be evidence, and I would grant it. So he said that there can't be natural things because of an infinite regress. You can have, just like you can say God is a necessary thing to be the grounds of everything, you can say naturalistic pantheism is the necessary thing to be the grounds of everything. You can just apply this omni property to anything you want and just say, here's the necessary thing, which is the grounds of everything. It's another one of those properties that science doesn't use because there's no way to differentiate it between an imaginary thing and which one is the actually real one. So it's not really a supportable position. Why would something that doesn't have a consciousness do something? Well, why does God do something? I mean, is it just random? Does he do it because it's a part of his nature, right? It's his nature. He has this nature which compels him to do something. But wait a minute, the word nature is in there, so can't I just say nature has some property in itself that causes it to do something? Like, wait, where's the difference here? Anything that a mind can do, unknown natural properties can also do, because there's reasons the mind does it. Like, for example, the nature of God. He does it because it's his nature. Well, we can say the nature of pantheism is why it does something like create a universe. All we're doing is saying, well, we don't understand why the universe was created. Well, we can just insert undiscovered law of nature or insert God with a conscious personal nature, and then now we have an explanation. But the reason scientists don't do this is, again, we can't tell a difference between the imaginary thing and the real one. It's just an assertion. He mentioned scientism. I am not a scientismist, or whatever you call them. I do not believe science is the only way to know things. And he's right. Logic, math, metaphysical truths, ethics and values, aesthetics, none of those are verifiable. Because what science does is it gives us a way to differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real. And from science perspective, all of those things, they're imaginary. Logic and math are formal languages. You can just go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, classical logic, first line, logic is a formal language. A formal language is like Python or C++. It's just a code that we use to describe things. So reality exists, reality is the way reality is, and we use logic and math to describe reality. They don't govern reality. They're not like things that exist outside of reality and force it to be a certain way. They're languages that we use to describe it. Metaphysical truths, the only metaphysical truth I know of is I think, therefore I am. That's like the only thing we can guarantee is a metaphysical truth. I exist because I experience and I can't not experience. But the big philosophical debate there, where that qualifies, don't know. Ethics and values, again, most philosophers are moral realists. They just don't believe that these things exist mind independently, and you don't need them to for them to be objective. Emergent properties can still be objective. For example, a triangle. Triangles don't exist. Like the perfect triangle doesn't exist. We can't find one anywhere. And if you drew like a triangle, you could zoom in and you see that it's not a perfectly straight line because the electrons are little bubble shapes. So it's impossible to draw a perfectly straight triangle. But we can still say that if there is a perfectly straight triangle, the angles add up to like 180 if it's a right angle. And so it has objective properties, even though it doesn't exist. And the same thing can be true of morality. Morality can be an abstract ideal that doesn't necessarily exist as a physical thing. And so you can still have objective morality, even if it's a product of a mind. And aesthetics was the last thing you mentioned. Again, the position on science is that's kind of an imaginary thing. It's a product of our mind. So from the position of science, like all of these things are essentially products of the mind. We don't have a way to differentiate the imaginary from the real because they're imaginary. So we can explain those in science pretty easily without any appeal to a God. So why doesn't God have the right to do what he wants with you? Well, because that's slavery. That's the definition of slavery. If someone owns you without your consent and you are forced to live for their purposes without consent, that's slavery. And I think most people would agree slavery is by definition immoral. It's not something that's okay. And so a moral God could not do that. And that's why God doesn't have the right to do what he wants with us, because it's immoral. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, for your rebuttal. We'll now move into the final rebuttal section before going into the open discussion section. Got the clock set for 5 minutes, Stephen. I'll start it on your first word.
All right, so I think when it comes to the problem of evil and suffering, we've hardly kind of touched on that. Like I said, it's a very important issue, so I'd like to cover that. But there's he presented a lot of points. I'd like to address each of those in turn. And so maybe during the discussion period we could talk about that or afterwards. Like I said, it's an important topic to me. It's important to you. I know a lot of our congregation. I actually preached on the topic of the problem of evil and suffering. I'm sure some people remember that. It's fresh in their minds. But we can return to it. Let's start with the first thing that he mentioned, that making infinity a property. So he's saying infinity is not something that, he's saying it's a property of something. The issue with that is you don't escape the problems of an infinite regress by calling it a property. You're giving it a different name, but you haven't escaped any of the problems. He brings up something that's called Zeno's paradox. So he's saying that, the numbers from 0 to 47 are also infinite. How could you possibly count to 47? Because you've got your traditional numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but then you've got 1.1 and 1.2, and then you've got 1.11, and so on ad infinitum. But the problem is this commits what's known as the fallacy of composition. That's counting parts of infinity and saying that because you can count parts of infinity, that therefore you can count the whole of infinity. The fallacy of composition is taking part of something and then applying the properties of that part to the whole thing. That's fallacious. That doesn't work. Number 3, this is the weird one. God can't create energy. Like the universe is a closed system, maybe more energy is being fed into it, and that God can't create it. Entropy is a problem for God. This is a weird rebuttal from my perspective. It seems to me that God's existing outside of the universe is similar to an author and his book. This is just an analogy, but let's say that some character in the novel you're writing says that since they can't create things out of thin air in the story that you're writing, that there's no way the author could do that. That's a ridiculous argument. Of course the author can do that. The author wrote the book. The author writes all the laws, rules, everything about the book. The author is the creator of the book's reality. It reminds me of this one time that a Russian cosmonaut went into space, and when he returned, he was interviewed, and he said he went all the way to space, and he didn't find God there. And C.S. Lewis responded with, that's kind of like Hamlet going up into the tower and saying that he didn't find William Shakespeare. Of course not. Is the universe a closed system? As far as I know, current cosmology says that it is a closed system. I'm willing to move on that point. I'm not a cosmologist. Surprise, surprise. But as far as I know, it's closed. But even still, we still have the philosophical problems of an infinite regress of time. So what exists outside of space and time? He's saying that it could be A, B, and C. And then he gave more stories. He gave examples. Maybe it's a spaceless, timeless pineapple. This goes back to my God with hats point before. You can say that it's a pineapple if you really want, but if it's a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, incredibly powerful, all-creating pineapple, you still have God. You just added the word pineapple for no reason. Clearly, it has nothing to do with what we know as a pineapple, because a pineapple is composed of matter. It exists within space and time. So some metaphysical, all-perfect pineapple, you can say that if you want. That's fine. But what you've described is still all of the properties of the classical God of the philosophers. So this is just God with more hats on. What people believe about objective morality doesn't matter. The argument does. So he said, most philosophers are moral realists. They believe this and that. He didn't really object to the moral argument that I presented or give any good reasons. He just said, I know some people that disagree with you, as if that was an argument. It wasn't. It's not a refutation. Naturalistic pantheism does not explain everything equally well, and we've already gone over why. We've gone over why the Kalam cosmological requires something with causality, why it has to be a mind, and with the moral argument, authority and personhood. So no, not anything can explain it. What we've found is that God is the only being that fits the description of what we're looking for. Why does God do something? Why did God create? That's a great question. But again, questions are not arguments. That's not a refutation to anything. You're simply asking a question about God's motives or nature. Okay, that's fair and fine. We can have a great discussion about that. But you've not made a point in saying that since I don't know why God would make a universe, therefore that's silly. No, that argument is silly. And lastly, the slavery definition, it's a really weird comparison. And there's no foundation. We're not comparing God to what happened in the American South. That's not at all like what God is like and what God's relationship to his creation is like. It is a completely false analogy. I don't quite understand it. I'm not even sure how to approach that. That's kind of a longer discussion that would need to be had. So with that, that's it for my second rebuttal.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your second rebuttal. We will now go to Tom for the final rebuttal before the open discussion. Got the clock set for 5 minutes, Tom.
All right, so he brought up infinites again. Well, there's such a thing as a countable infinite. It's called alf null. So, I mean, I'm not sure what his basis is to say that you can't describe countable infinites in the way, and this is a composition division fallacy. Well, no, there's literally a countable infinite. It's called alpha null. My point with the first law is that if we apply the laws of physics to everything, to absolutely everything, well, then we also have to apply them to God. And if God can be an exclusion and the first law not apply to him, well, then I can say, well, there could be natural things that the second law doesn't apply to. So if you want to say, there's a double standard here. He's saying that, well, because of entropy, and entropy applies to everything, well, then naturalism can't explain the origin of the universe because it must have some kind of a beginning due to entropy. But he's also saying, well, no, God doesn't apply to the first law doesn't apply to God because he's outside of space and time. Well, I can just say the same thing about some undiscovered natural property. It also applies outside of time, and so the second law doesn't apply to it. So the same argument works both ways. If you want to say that the laws of physics apply to everything, and so therefore nothing can escape entropy, well, then God can't escape entropy. And if you want to say the laws of physics apply to everything, well, then God can't escape the first law either, which means you can't create energy. So if you want to say that something can exist outside of the laws of physics, well, then so can I. I can say, yep, naturalistic pantheism, there's an undiscovered natural thing that exists outside of known nature and can escape entropy in the first law, just like you can. So the same argument, like that example with the rabbit in the box, these same properties can be explained by a God, but they could also be explained by any non-God. But again, it's just going outside of the known laws. If science was allowed to go outside of the known laws to things we can't verify, well, then we'd just be making stuff up, and anybody can do that, which is why science doesn't do it. The moral argument, no, it does not require mind. Again, the reason is because the first premise, or whichever premise that says it requires a God, is false. You don't need a God for objective moral values and duties. That was kind of the point of my triangle analogy. Triangles have objective properties. They don't exist. They could be a figment of our imagination, but they can still have objective properties. You can have objective properties of emergent things. So even if morality is just a product of our mind, it can still be objective. You don't need a God for that. You don't need a God for objective morality. There could be an undiscovered law of nature that permeates the universe. That would be objective morality. You don't need a God for that. So that premise is just false. This argument is unsound for that reason. So why did God create? Again, the point here was that there is something that causes God to create, which is his nature. He has some particular aspect of his nature which causes him to create. And we don't know what that is, right? We could say, well, we don't know what God did. We don't know why God would create, therefore that's not an argument against God. He's absolutely right. But the same thing applies to nature. If we don't know why nature would create a universe, that's not an argument against it. It could have created for some unknown reason, just like God could have created for some unknown reason. You can't just assume, well, we don't know why it did it, we don't know how it did it, therefore it didn't do it. The argument doesn't work like that. As he said, he was correct in that, completely correct in that. That was my entire point. You can't just say, we don't know, therefore it couldn't happen. Not slavery? Wait a minute. Because if I read the definition of slavery again, a person owned by someone else under the control of someone else or forced to work for another's purposes without consent. A slave is considered property of another as the one controlling them purchases them or owns them from birth or creation. That's the definition of slavery, and if we are created by a God and forced to live for his purposes in his world, which, as Stephen admitted, he has the right to do under theism, that's the definition of slavery. So, I mean, I'm not sure how this isn't an apt analogy, since it literally fits the definition of slavery. If, by his admission, we are property of God, then we are slaves, and I consider that immoral. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. We will now move into the open discussion section. So we generally tend to be pretty laissez-faire, so kind of let it go with the flow. Given that both debaters are seasoned, they've got some under their belt already, I think that we shouldn't have to worry about any sort of interjecting by me in case anyone speaks over anybody else. So, gentlemen, I trust you. I'm excited to listen to this, and I am starting the timer for 30 minutes.
Let's get intimate. It's right up here. All right. You killed it. So I just wanted to open by saying I don't know how many, not everybody knows it, but Tom and I actually spent the whole day together. We had a really good time. We had lunch at Good Company. So by the way, he's not from here. He's from Minnesota, so he didn't really know. He's like, you got to show me where.
Ooh, cold.
Then we went to High Cliff, and unfortunately didn't get to see the cliffs, which he's like super into rock climbing, so that would have been cool. But we did get.
You
to
taught me how to longboard?
Yeah. And then we saw the whole valley from the tower up there. So that was a lot of fun. So I didn't think tonight's debate would be contentious or disrespectful. I don't know how many of these you've had, but it's fun. It's super fun. We should do this again really soon.
Absolutely, yes. Awesome.
All right. Sorry, with that out of the way. All right. What do you want to talk about?
Let's start with you. What do you have any? Because I think I've addressed most of your points as far as I'm concerned. I mean, the one thing is like, would you disagree that, what does objective mean? Like when you talk about objective morality, if I said there was a law of nature kind of like gravity, would you say gravity is objective?
No.
Gravity is not objective?
Not in the sense of, so it's objective in a different way, not in the way that morality is objective. So the way that I would define something objectively moral is something, and this is where we get into waters that are outside of the particular debate that we had. So within Christian theism, I would say that moral values and duties are an extension of God's own nature, his own character. So with something like gravity, I would say that that's something that's a creation of God as a constant. So from our standpoint, from a practical standpoint, we may as well call it objective. But from a truly like the grounds of reality, I wouldn't say that it ultimately is objective. I would say that moral absolutes are actually more objective, or in a sense, actually objective, where something like gravity is something that God could just change at whim. So I would suggest that God didn't arbitrarily choose, like he woke up and was like, I think I'm going to make murder bad today, you know? We're just going to run with that. I think that since God is life, then his command against murder would just be a natural extension of his own nature.
Okay, so from my perspective, I would define objective as pretty much the same in all contexts. It's just something mind independent, something that's true independent of anyone's say-so or opinion.
Yeah.
So in my position, science is objective because it's true independent of what we think about it. And morality, if grounded in God, could be objective because it's true regardless of what we think about it. But that would also apply to like gravity. So could you explain to me the difference there? Like how exactly do you define objectivity in these two different ways? Because I'm not familiar with that.
Sure, that's I'm not sure how to put it in a different way than I explained it, but I'll do my best. So in terms of science and the scientific method, those are things that are objective insofar as the universe, the physical reality, space-time reality is consistent. God has created it in such a way that we can expect consistency, and I believe that there are plenty of reasons for that, but I think that reality could have been otherwise. That God could have created an entirely different kind of reality, different set of laws, physics, beings, history, anything and everything, whereas God's moral commandments, something like don't murder because God is life himself, that's where I would say God couldn't have made it other than it is. So I would say objective, so I actually have a video on the axiological argument, the moral argument. I'm sure you've watched it in preparation for some of the stuff. In that, I define objective morality as wholly independent of personal or corporate preference, thought, and opinion. Subjective morality is just the opposite. It's dependent on corporate or personal preference, thought, or opinion. So with science, is it something that is objective from our perspective? Absolutely, just not from God's perspective. So I would say in an ultimate sense, it's not as objective as something like morality.
So the way I interpret that is that seems kind of like special pleading, where you're arguing that for this new category of objective that applies only in this one special case. I don't really, because it doesn't really, I don't know of a philosophical way to interpret that definition, or I don't know a philosophical source where that definition is used. Because it seems like when you apply the word objective, it usually goes pretty large scope. It can apply to laws of, it's essentially just anything that isn't mind dependent.
Sure. I would say it would be special pleading if I had two different categories of objective. But I'm not calling the laws of like gravity or the laws of nature, I'm not calling those objective. I said from a practical standpoint. So in terms of us using science as a tool, we can call it that if we'd like, but from my perspective, the only thing that's objective is anything that reflects the nature of God.
So you would say the laws of physics and the laws of science, those are all subjective?
From God's perspective. From our perspective, no. So that's a really fine line that I want to establish firmly. So I wouldn't say that something like the speed of light is subjective. I would say that that's unchanging all the time. But if you ask me in an ultimate sense, in the grounding of reality, is that something that could be other than it is? I would say, yeah. Yeah, it could have been other than it was.
All right. I went one, so do you want a question?
Sure. So I've noticed a lot in your debates, you typically use naturalistic pantheism as like a catch-all for, all right, you presented these theistic arguments, I'm going to, I guess, it's not necessarily a question, but one thing that I wanted to, there's a question in there. When it comes to naturalistic pantheism, I tried super hard to find it on like the Stanford Encyclopedia. That's where you talked about it, right? I looked there. I found pantheism, which didn't even mention naturalistic pantheism. It argued, the way it defined pantheism, it seemed to contradict. So if anybody's not familiar, from my understanding, naturalism is simply the belief that there is no God, that everything is a natural state of affairs. Pantheism is that the universe is God. That can take, both of those can take on many different forms. You can find pantheism in things like Hinduism or Buddhism, other things, but putting them together, I guess I'm curious what that even is. So we had a conversation earlier where you said compatibilism is just determinism, and I laughed and I was like, yeah, that's what I think. To me, naturalistic pantheism is just naturalism. What would you say about that?
Right, so it is on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It is under
Yeah.
pantheism. It's not under the first section. It's under section 4, where it says there are 3 kinds of pantheism. The first one is physicalism, and then it specifically says this was the kind of pantheism adopted by the Stoics, and there's a modern kind that's referred to as naturalistic pantheism, and it essentially says that it's only adopts ontological commitments of science. So it is in there. You could just do a Control-F search for naturalistic pantheism, and it should pop up immediately.
Okay.
And there's also...
Will you send me the link to that?
Yes, I can. I'll give you the exact quote. I have it saved because people ask me this all the time. It's
You
like
guys
the
should look
first
it up
thing.
too.
But so there's also section 6 where it talks about Einstein, where it says there's many pantheists the defining characteristic of pantheism for many pantheists is that it's not conscious, that it has no consciousness, no mind. So it's not really that the universe is divine, but it's everything is divine. Everything is divine. And naturalism isn't the position there is no God, it's just the position that there is no supernatural. Because there are naturalists who believe in a God, strangely enough. I don't know how that works, but it's just everything is natural.
Okay. I mean, that last little bit doesn't give me enough to say, oh, I guess there's naturalism where God can exist. That sounds
Different
insane
topic.
to me.
Yeah, it's different topic.
Okay, different topic. I guess one thing that I'm curious about is, I think personhood is a pretty powerful contender for why theism would be favored over something like pantheism. It doesn't seem like a law would suddenly create a universe. You brought up interesting questions about, well, why would God decide to make a universe? Granted, that's a great question. I have my own thoughts on that. But in terms of the ability, it certainly seems like a mind or an agent would have the ability at least, whereas something like pantheism wouldn't even get off the ground, unless there's an infinite regress where it's always just been there. How would you respond to that?
Well, it's the same thing as like if 2,000 years ago, if we see lightning, we can say, well, hey, that could be explained by a mind. I can imagine there's a guy up there who's just hammering away like Hephaestus, creating lightning, and then Zeus just throws it down. That makes perfect sense. We can explain that with the mind. Or it could be explained by an undiscovered natural process. And we can apply the same thing in the context of what created the universe. It could be the case that it was created by a mind, it's possible, or it could be the case that it's created by a natural thing. And you mentioned an infinite regress. I would not say that there's an infinite regress. I would say the same thing, that there's a natural explanation that could be the necessary thing as opposed to a God. And just like God has a particular nature which caused him to want to create the universe, pantheism or naturalistic pantheism would have a particular nature which would cause it to be determined to create the universe.
Okay, so I think when it comes to that, so we talked earlier, you debated inspiring philosophy, and you guys got hung up on this extremely convoluted and difficult subject. I think we're almost nearing those waters, so Tom and I are really interested in having a debate and a discussion that does not go into extreme
Technical stuff.
yeah, and it's something that is easy to get bogged down into, and the debate just becomes very uninteresting because you're hung on one topic for the whole time. But I would say when it comes to the personhood of God, without going any further, I think someone like Ed Feser's arguments, like the Aristotelian argument, for me confirm pretty boldly that personhood is something that would just naturally follow with the identity of God. But yeah, that's too much to unpack, and I'm sure you would have too much to say about it. So we'll kind of move on from that. Let's talk about the problem of evil, because I never got a chance to kind of rebut that. How big of a problem is the problem of evil for you?
Well, it's not specifically the problem of evil. It's the variation. It's the problem of involuntary suffering. So there could be a reason to allow evil, but if there's something that could always be like a morally superior option, well, then that negates the reason to justify evil. So if you could always make something optional and say any good that could be allowed from experiencing suffering, that could be made better if you make it optional. So for example, you may learn something if you experience suffering. Well, if you said, well, you give this person the option where they can experience suffering and can experience learning, or they can be like, no, I don't really want that. I'm going to go over here and not do that. That's a morally superior option. And because it's morally superior, that means that if there's an all-good God, he would have to choose the morally superior option over the less moral option, the more immoral option. And that refutes the Christian God, because God is supposedly all good, but the world we live in has one major flaw. It wasn't optional, which means we can necessarily make it more moral. There's a morally superior option that God didn't choose. So we can't be perfectly moral.
Okay. I think when it comes to some of the other arguments, you kind of plead for maybe there's a scientific explanation that we haven't discovered at some point. So, all right, you've given an answer, you've given a plausible answer, but it's not our only option. And I ask, what is the other option? And you kind of say, well, it's reasonable to just say, I don't know, but maybe there's other possibilities. And if those possibilities are maybe as likely, which I didn't think they were, but we'll move on from that. I'll just concede that point for this illustration. When you appeal to, yeah, but there must be another explanation, there could be something else, I think to remain consistent, you could probably say the same about the problem of evil. When you say that, well, I can imagine God could have say that there's a better option where he gives someone the option to choose according to their own free will, I would say that according to what you've said, maybe it would be consistent for you to say, but there could be another option. God may have other reasons for why things are the way that they are, and we haven't discovered it yet. So I think that's just as valid. I think when it comes to the problem of evil and suffering, typically I find that people, and not necessarily you, but people make two really big mistakes with that argument. The first is that they assume that if God could stop evil and suffering and he's good, then he would necessarily want to. The issue with that is we have lots of examples in our life where we permit lesser evils and suffering for greater goods. So the first example is childbirth. So a mother doesn't consider the pain and the anguish of childbirth after she's holding her baby. It was worth it in the end. She's holding something that's infinitely precious to her that pain could never take away. Or going to the dentist, it's incredibly painful, and yet it's suffering that you're choosing to go through for a greater good at the end. Or even something like going to war, World War II, fighting the good fight. That's a lot of people that were at war that were killed, but that's a lot of innocents killed as well. War is bloody and messy and terrible, but it was considered the righteous thing to go to war to stop the German machine from doing what it was doing. So I think the second thing that people think about the problem of evil is they say, if God is all-powerful, he can do anything. But I'm sure you're familiar with the free will defense. God can't create square circles. He can't create married bachelors. And he can't create people that have free will that always do what he wants. And so I think in that scenario, if God wants to create a world with free beings, I think it's no fault of God that we've messed it up.
All right, so you brought up 3 points there. The first point was, well, couldn't there be some reason to allow suffering that we just don't know about yet? Well, the strength of my argument is that whatever that reason may be, you can always make it better, no matter what. You can say, well, let's take that reason and say, let's make it optional. Now we've just made it better. So whatever that option may be, regardless of whether or not we know it or not, you can always make it morally superior by making it optional. Say, you can learn something or whatever it is. I can take that and say, okay, you should give the person, whoever you're creating, the being, the option to experience that greater good or the option to opt out. And that will always necessarily make it more moral, which means there can't really be an option that we don't know about. Because whatever it is, there's always going to be a better one. Give them the option. The second one you brought up was childbirth, like we experience suffering and there's some good that comes out of it. Well, the reason we came up with epidurals is because it's better to have the option to experience the pain and the option not to. So it's giving the woman the option to experience the pain or the option not to is a morally superior option than forcing her to go through the pain for the reward of the childbirth. The same thing applies in this case. Whatever that positive reason may be for allowing suffering, you can always make it better, just make it optional. And what was the third thing you said? The last one?
God can't do the logically impossible.
God
Creatures
can't do
of
the
free
logically
will.
impossible. Right, so this world I'm describing where we essentially get the option is something that we can create, like technologically or will be in the future, called The Matrix. Like you've seen the movie The Matrix? Pretty good movie. Yeah.
So a simulation of that.
Well, yeah, so we can create artificial worlds and give people the option to participate in a world with suffering, like a high difficulty video game or something like this world, or we can give them the option to not do that. So if we can do it, then God should probably be able to do it, or there might be some problem with God. So, I mean, it's hard for me to accept the argument that it's impossible for God to do this if we can do it. Do you see the logic behind that?
I see what you're saying. I'd say that us creating a virtual reality is really not us actually doing that. To me, that sounds like a Black Mirror episode about to air on Netflix. But it's, in all seriousness, I think I like your idea that, what if there's some reality where people got to choose? I just wouldn't concede that that's necessarily better than God's reason. Since we don't have access to God's reason, we can postulate and we can have theodicies all day long. If we don't actually have that, but we have something like the free will defense in place to just halt the problem of evil, but not necessarily give it the answer that it's thirsting for, just to stop it from being a problem. What is that reason? Unless we have it, I don't know how you could find any confidence that, well, if I got to choose, that would be better. That's not necessarily true. Children want to choose for themselves all sorts of things that we do not let them choose, and it's for their ultimate happiness and their betterment. We don't let our children play in highway traffic, even though imposing our will on them is highly restrictive to their freedoms. We know what's best for them, and they don't. So it's, that's really large, complicated. If you'd like to stick on the problem of evil for a while more, if you had more points, we could stay there. But we could probably spend the rest of the night on that topic.
So, just to conclude, it's like saying numbers. We can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can always say we can get one more. We can get one higher. Yeah. So in my case of the analogy argument, it's kind of like saying that. Whatever number you say, I can always plus one it and say make it optional. So whatever you add in, I can always say make it optional, make it optional, make it optional. And unless you can present an alternative, which is pretty much impossible, where you can say, well, no, you can't say make it possible at this point. You can't say make it an option. But we can always say, well, make it optional, make it optional. And since that can go on with an infinite regress, it's not really possible for you to say, well, no, there's this one reason that just makes it impossible to give you the option to do it.
Sure. I guess I'm not necessarily saying that there's a reason that the option couldn't be there. I'm saying that there could be a reason that is ultimately better than being given the option, that we don't have access to that, that having the option may not be the greatest of all possible worlds, that perhaps this actually is the greatest of all possible worlds, just not at this particular moment in time, but it will be.
Well, I would just disagree and say it would be better if it was optional. It seems morally, intuitively justified to say this world is not the best of all possible worlds, and it can clearly be made better with one change, make it optional. That's all it takes. Like if I have the option to not live in this world of suffering and to go to my own world, it seems clearly morally superior than being forced here to suffer against all of the terrible things that happen in this world. Giving them the option to not be here seems clearly morally superior.
Sure. Well, I would say that in the end, I think everybody does have that option. Rejecting God, wanting nothing to do with reality and being and grounding, probably get way too complicated with different theories of hell or annihilationism or eternal torment or whatever that is. But I don't have the time for that. I know you do. So yeah, we'll just have to part ways on that for now, and that's our perspective on the problem of evil. Really complicated problem, by the way, whether you're an atheist or a Christian, whatever you believe about that topic. I think that's probably one of the most difficult to study and try to understand.
My second question for you would be, you mentioned that alternatives are not refutations. Would you agree that an alternative, if it was equally, had the same explanatory scope, explanatory power, that is a refutation?
It'd be a refutation to the claim that that was the only viable option, yeah.
Well, my claim would be that it's not more supported than the alternatives.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, that's my only argument there, so.
Sure. Yeah, I'll leave it at where it's at, but just to disagree on that. All right, so any other topic you wanted to
I got
cover?
two. You're up for your second one.
I'm down for my second one. So for me, let's reel it into Christianity for a little bit. I'm just curious on your thoughts. I haven't prepared a lot to defend biblical authority, the historical reliability, or especially arguments about biblical ethics. But just from like a personal standpoint, what is your perspective on some of this? I remember hearing you you were live on Facebook. You mentioned that you thought Jesus, the character of Jesus, was almost uninteresting, that there was nothing special about him. Is that really your perspective of Jesus?
I'm not sure where I said that. I said that I believe Jesus existed as a human being, but he was just like a human being, like every other human being. He's not no magical powers, so uninteresting in the magical powers way. He's still interesting as a person,
sure,
but no interesting magical powers.
So when you say interesting, I mean, what about Jesus stands out to you? Like what? I guess if let's say tomorrow you had some reason to absolutely believe there was a God, and there's these different religions on the table that say, well, we've got a God. You've got the monotheistic, and for some reason you've got a reason for monotheism. Is Christianity on the table for you, or is it just never going to be on the table?
Well, the idea of Jesus, I'm not opposed to Jesus, but the Old Testament God, I'm vehemently opposed to. All of the suffering, like one of my friends on YouTube, Doug Pine Creek, he has this analogy that God drowned babies during the flood, world flood. That kind of, nope, can't worship that God anymore. That God cannot be all good. That pretty much ends it with that God as being a potential candidate.
Sure. Well, that brings us back into the problem of evil and suffering. That's fair. It's very tempting. Every time it comes up, I'm like, let's jump in and do it. No, but it's like when you're hanging out with your Christian friends and they want to get into the debate about predestination versus free will, and then it's 3 a.m., and you work the next day, and you're like, why did I do this again? When will I learn? So, how much time do we have on our open dialogue? 6? James, you want to be a part of this?
I would, but I'm honestly enjoying this so much that I would be happy to give you the last 6 minutes. I have to say that I don't want to put the pressure on you. This is one of the most enjoyable debates that I've gotten to listen to in so long. So we can go to the closing statements.
I got more questions.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I bet you guys love this part way more than me reading off my sheet. I'm like, Kalam, premise 3, and then Tom's like, naturalistic pineapple God. This is more fun. This is a lot more fun.
Yeah, I like it. What did you say? I was just asserting the Christian God plus an addition
Plus
of
hats.
pineapple?
Yeah, hats, whatever. Yeah.
So I
pineapple.
would just say you're asserting something that's eternal, all powerful, with the addition of consciousness unnecessarily. That's your pineapple.
Just personhood.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Consciousness. You're right.
Yep.
But I had reasons for that consciousness being a necessary prerequisite. So like, to me, the kalam and the moral kind of support that. Not alone. I think probably the tightest argument would be the Aristotelian proof. That's like a 52 premise long argument that I don't have memorized.
The Phaser version?
The Phaser version. I haven't had a lot of time to really dig into that and see how reasonable or unreasonable it is, but it did really strike me when I first read it. I was impressed.
His book, The Five Proofs of the Existence of God?
Yeah, it was interesting because a lot of people are more like evidentialists. You know, they want to say, you know, here's reasons that support the existence of God, you know, and they kind of lay these arguments on a scale, and if you've got enough in the scale, you know, and you put the problem of evil and suffering on the other side of the scale, you know, if you offer enough good theistic arguments, the idea is you want the scale to tip, and you're like, bing, 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 there's a God. But with Phaser, you know, he's not interested in evidentialism, he's interested in proofs. He's like, I'm going to start with these things, and then reason my way to there's definitely a God, inescapably, logically. So I found that really interesting. I'm not sure how sold into that I am, but it's really appealing.
Yeah, I oppose Thomism vehemently also.
That's fair.
So I'd love to debate him on those topics.
I don't know enough about Thomism to get into it with you, let alone Phaser.
So I wanted to ask you about the infinites thing. So
Yeah.
you understand, or infinites aren't actually numbers, right? Infinites are
Right.
properties of sets.
Right, but I'm using numbers as an analogy for infinites. So I mean, you can't count part of an infinite set and then say that the properties of that are equal to the whole thing. That's the fallacy of composition, isn't it?
If my argument was dependent on that, but it wasn't. I was just using the analogy of picking a number, like 47. You can pick a particular infinite, the size of an infinite or scope of an infinite, and do the same thing. So I was also using numbers as an analogy there to make it relatable.
I mean, maybe we could go to something like, what do you think about the absurdities in Hilbert's Hotel? I mean, do you think that that's a good argument against actual infinities existing in the world? I'm all for saying that theoretically or on a chalkboard we can talk about infinity, but when it gets to like the real world, that's where some really weird stuff starts to happen.
Well, yeah, actual infinites can't exist because infinites are like variables, like x. Like if you say x plus x equals what? Well, you can get multiple answers. You can get 5 if the first x is 1 and the second x is 4. But you can get 7 if the first x is 3 and the second x is 4. So you can get multiple answers or contradictory answers. You can get zeros or negatives if you have two different size x's.
Yeah.
And the same thing applies to infinites. If you have an infinite of one size, that's a big infinite, and an infinite of another size, which is a small infinite, and you subtract them, you're going to get a positive infinite. But if you have an infinite of a small size minus an infinite of a big size, you'll get a negative infinite. And if you have an infinite of one size and an infinite of the exact same size, you'll get 0. These aren't contradictory. There's not a paradox here. The only paradox is that infinites have values, and you have to deliberately, in set theory, which deals with infinites, you have to define specifically what the value is before you do the equation. Just saying infinite plus infinite is like saying x plus x without telling us what the x's are. It's the reason the paradox exists is because it's vague. You need to be very specific about the infinites. Like I mentioned, there is a countable infinite, which is alpha null. And there's bigger infinites, and there's infinites that are bigger than infinites, which are alpha or omega something, omega and big theta.
Some fun
and
words.
There's there's a YouTube video about this, all the different kinds of infinites. But
Watched it and forgot it.
Yeah. So the reason you can't have actual infinites is the reason you can't have actual x's. You're never going to discover an x number of things under a rock because x isn't a number.
Okay. So do we agree on that? Like, let's not even say, oh, therefore my argument's true, but you know, do we just feel the same way about actual infinities in the universe? Like, do you have a problem with infinite regresses? Not necessarily, but you lean that way?
There's only a problem if you don't define what infinite means. If you define the particular infinite, there's not a problem.
Okay. I guess it feels really hard to define it.
Yes, that's why set theory is super complicated.
Okay. So you'll just leave it on the table like maybe it could, but I've never seen it do that. So
You guys have 1 minute to solve what an infinite is.
yeah, isn't this part of the conversation fun? What is an infinite? Yeah, you know, I mean, in terms of other things that we talked about, I feel like we covered a lot of ground in various theistic arguments. I really wish there was time to go over more and even have, your rebuttals and inputs. Because, at the end when I kind of listed off, like, teleological argument from consciousness, that wasn't just some kind of rhetorical ploy to say, like, here's a big long list, don't pay attention too much to the contents of the list, just see it's a list and be impressed and go on. Like, I sincerely love those arguments. I could have made a long list. I could have made like a 20 argument long list, but I wouldn't have loved the whole list. Like, there's lots of arguments for God's existence that I'm like, I don't know about that one.
I would need like an extra hour or so to go through those.
Yeah, but it's. I'm really glad that we got to have this kind of discussion to just open people's minds to the idea that people think very critically about the existence of God, and they try to come up with answers for and against. I guess largely we both share, would you say, that kind of desire that people would sort of get off of the train tracks, get off of the fence, to not be apatheists and try to delve through the issues, that not everybody needs to be an expert or a scholar, but that to think a little bit about some of these important issues, because our eternal destiny might rest on whether we're right or not.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think these kinds of things are really great because they bring forth topics that people normally don't get exposed to. And I hope we did an interesting and compelling enough job to get people interested and engaged with these topics more than they are. Because one of the things is, on both sides, Christians and atheists, they don't really consider the deep arguments very well. They're like, yeah, I kind of believe this for whatever superficial reason. They don't really delve into the philosophy behind it and what reasons we really have to believe. And I hope that we can portray it in an interesting enough way to get you guys into the philosophy stuff.
Yeah, and if you didn't get much from this, I had a lot of fun. So, thank you.
Me too.
Thank you, gentlemen. We will now move into the brief closing statements before Q&A. So each speaker will have 5 minutes to do their closing statement where you could say draw together the threads of the debate, and then, like I said, we will go to the Q&A. So for the Q&A, as mentioned, we will prioritize the questions from the audience, the live audience, and then if we run out of questions, we will go to questions from the live chat from the online stream. And when we do get to that point, what we'll do is have people line up at each microphone and alternate from side to side. So with that, I am setting the clock, and thank you, gentlemen, very much for that excellent conversation. I am setting it for 5 minutes, and Stephen, I will start it on your first word. The floor is yours.
Drinking this really cold coffee feels strangely appropriate right now. That's where we started. So I talked to my dad earlier today, and he tried to give me, advice for the debate. Like, we went to lunch, and my dad's like, "Don't talk about the debate on lunch. He's going to be trying to, hear you out and get a bead on where you're going with it." And I was like, "Okay, Dad, sure." Just like, yeah. And at one part he told me, and I told him, "Dad, I don't know why, because I've preached in front of these people and I've spoken. I believe in the arguments and evidence, but for no reason apparently I feel really nervous." And he said, if you just speak from the heart, that's all that you really need. And I remember when he said that, just kind of having this almost mocking attitude towards what he said. I'm like, "Dad, you don't understand. This is a philosophical debate, scientific debate. I can't be bringing anecdotal evidence or feelings. That's not going to convince anybody who's here thinking critically through the issues." But I think we've gone through some arguments. We've explored some premises. I've given some supporting reasons for what I believe in. And right now, for my closing statement, I believe my dad was right. I want to tell you the truth. I want to tell you what I really sincerely experience and believe. For me, these arguments are supportive of something that I know emphatically, something that I know as much as I know I think, therefore I am. My own existence is so obvious to me, and in the same way, Jesus Christ is so obvious to me. Out of all the arguments for whether or not you could know God exists, I think the most powerful is that you can experience God for yourself. That if you're searching for God, that tonight is not an accident. You're not here randomly. I sincerely believe that God is reaching out to you, that God cares about you, that God loves you. God has radically transformed my absolutely destitute life into what it is now. But that's not why I worship him. I don't worship God because he's changed my life or that he's helped me through certain addictive things or strongholds or prisons. I worship God because I've witnessed what he's like and who he really is. And that's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing this. God is the reason for living. He's the reason for everything. I love God. And if you don't know him, I want you to know that you can. And for me, that's the last argument that I offer. Not the first, but it's the last one. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that closing statement, Stephen. And we will now move to the closing statement from Tom. I have the clock set for 5 minutes, Tom.
I just want to say thank you to all you guys again for coming out and watching the debate. This is a great community. I love your church, a beautiful place. You guys are really awesome to be around. Thank you, Stephen, for the great day and teaching me how to wakeboard. And when I crashed that one time, that was so much fun. This is a wonderful place. I love you guys. I love this community. It's great talking about this publicly and being able to do this debate. And I want to thank the church for hosting it. It's so cool for me. I really love this. So to conclude, I am an atheist because I don't see any reason to believe that God is not one of the imaginary things. I don't see any way that evidence or argument that differentiates a God from the non-imaginary alternatives that we can come up with. I trust very, very much in science because science does show us the difference between here's the imaginary thing and here's the non-imaginary thing. It's a really good way to do that. It doesn't solve all the problems. There's lots of things science can't answer, but ultimately it gives us the best grounds for knowledge that I can really trust. And Stephen said that we can know God tonight, and great, that would be awesome. Have him come to me like right now, present a gold brick. No gold brick. I mean, I've never seen a way to differentiate God from the imaginary. How do I know him? Like, I've prayed. I used to be a Christian. I grew up, brought up in a Catholic household, went to church, went to Christian schools, all the stuff for up until high school. And I prayed every day. But I never heard, none of my prayers were ever answered. I never heard this meeting Jesus that Stephen talks about. Like, where is this? I mean, I tried pretty hard, and I never heard anything. None of my prayers were ever answered. And it's not just me. This is a big part of the atheist community. We try to meet God. We really, really do. But we hear crickets, and that's it. So it's also really, really hard for me to believe in God because of the whole problem of suffering thing, but don't want to get back into that. So that's essentially my position. It's just I want the evidence. I want some way to differentiate a God from one of the imaginary alternatives, and I don't see it. That's why I'm an atheist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. We will now move into the Q&A, and just letting you know that we are totally trusting you. I've been to debates where they would sometimes have somebody standing next to the microphone to eventually yank it away if someone went into a diatribe. So we would just ask that it's totally okay if you have a kind of a setup for your question where you say, hey, I wanted to run this idea by you, and what do you think of this, given what you said in the debate? Totally cool. We're just looking for questions, though, in particular. So if you do have any questions, please line up right now, and we will start the Q&A session. That's totally up to you. think we will start on my left or your right. If you'd like to ask the first question, and of course, if you want to just mention who your question is for at the beginning, and if you'd like, you can ask the question to both speakers as well.
Okay. Well, first, I just want to say you guys it's pretty awesome just seeing the dedication, just how much of your time that you guys both spend to study, and it's definitely not my conviction to, be as deep into a lot of these issues as you guys are, but it's super cool just to see, what you guys both do, and so I'm much more simple-minded as far as a lot of things go. But so this question is for Tom. So I heard you use a lot of the terms if and could and possibly and unknown natural when addressing, just different topics, scientific or otherwise. But science does name concepts by name, not unknown. And you say that science stops at what can't be tested. You also say that science gives us a way to differentiate between the imaginary and not imaginary. So most in the scientific community, and this may not be you, but most in the scientific community that I'm aware of anyway, they name spontaneous generation, for instance, as the origin of the first life form, which is the foundation really of, from the first life form till we got here. It's a concept that's deduced to make a bridge between no life and life, because we can all agree that we're alive in here. Well, most people would probably agree with that.
Most of us.
Yeah, right, most of us.
I object.
So
Sorry.
Spontaneous generation kind of being the bridge between no life and life. It has not been tested or duplicated even once in a lab, making it not scientific. It is just a theory. So would that widely accepted theory be equal or have more merit than deistic creation?
Well, taking the position we don't know would have more merit. So we could come up with an explanation. In fact, there are lots and lots of different hypothetical explanations of the origin of life, abiogenesis. Mm-hmm. And recently, we actually have seen a lot of progress in this. So we've seen RNA, which is the foundation of DNA, being made by itself on clay. So we've seen the basis of DNA forming from lifeless inorganic material on its own, on clay. And then
That's someone all placed there.
What?
That's someone all put together in one place.
No, this is on its own. They just put it.
Okay.
Just put it together. It forms on its own in clay, and we can know a DNA can form from RNA. I actually had a debate on this with Dr. Fuzz Rana from Reasons to Believe. Mm-hmm. So we've actually been making lots and lots of progress on this, and it seems like this is just one of those unknown things, like lightning. 2,000 years ago, we couldn't explain lightning.
Correct.
So is Zeus a better explanation than we don't know? We're going to withhold judgment until we have evidence? Well, I'd say no. I'd say the best explanation is we're going to withhold judgment until we have better evidence. For example, it's like induction. If we see white goose, white goose, white goose, white goose, white goose, and then we see a blank, the next best explanation is either we don't know or white goose. It's not black goose. And as far as we can tell, throughout all of history, all of the discoveries that have ever been made have always been natural. So we have natural explanation, natural explanation, natural explanation. So the next most reasonable conclusion is that the next unknown is probably going to be a natural explanation, not a supernatural one.
Okay.
And I would say the same thing about life.
Okay, thank you.
Would I be able to have a 30-second, I guess, quick on that? So when it comes to arguments for God based off of microbiology, I personally, I don't really utilize that. If that's something that you're passionate about and can utilize that well, that's cool. I think it's easier and more potent to go with like the fine-tuning argument, because it's more or less the same argument, but with fine-tuning, it's on a grander and even more difficult scale. Like the cosmological constant is tuned to 10 to 120th power. That's insane. That's an inconceivable number. So I think that cosmology is easy enough that you wouldn't have to appeal to biology for the fine-tuning of life. But yeah, that's all I had on that.
Testing?
Quicker question?
Is this working? All right. Hello. So the fun one, I have a couple-part question because, well, I had some questions, but then I had to rewrite my questions because Stephen literally covered what my questions were. Good job, by the way. Like, I'll show you later. It's like word for word. But this first one is a fun theoretical question for anyone that we're probably not going to answer. If science can really answer anything that theology can answer, how many universes has the letter X created? And if the letter X created universe, does creating said universes give the letter X personhood and consciousness? I think
Who are you asking?
it's a joke. It's kind of a covering of the whole.
All right.
It's,
The answer is the square root of a pork chop.
yes. That's how I feel about abstract concepts, creating things out of nothing for no reason. That was the point of the joke. Now for Tom.
You want a second question?
Now for Tom. You think like I do. I see a lot of myself in you as a younger individual who was atheist at one point. You're probably very high in openness in terms of like the big traits, that kind of idea. You seem to be open to any and every idea that isn't God existing, as you covered kind of in your description. So to me, suggesting possibilities is not providing proof. It's interesting, it's fun to listen to, it's not convincing though. The proof of Christianity is the thousands and millions of transformed lives with personal experience and sometimes direct interaction with God, which you dismiss as illusionary. So why is it that if we were to say, take a judgment of beauty, which is something that, as Stephen talked about, can't be determined by science, we would say this is the most attractive person in America today. We would not use a scientific method to do that. And what I believe is God, in terms of experiencing him, has decided to not use science as a method to determine who he is. It's almost like he's hiding from science. Why are you determined to prove him through something it's obvious he doesn't want to be proved through, if that makes sense?
Well, a couple things there. So science explains beauty through evopsychology. It's just a product of our brains due to evolution and social constructs. I would say it's essentially the same as what is the tastiest meal. I do not believe that God, or I believe that you probably wouldn't say that God grounds the judgment of tastiest. He doesn't have a property of the tastiest food. It's just kind of subjective product of evolution. Well, beauty is the same thing. Science does explain beauty perfectly well. So I don't really see a problem there. But I wouldn't say the universe was created by abstract things. I've never said the universe was created by an abstract object. In fact, I think essentially no atheists believe that. They all believe that some natural thing has just always existed. There's always been a natural thing or something natural that exists outside of space-time, like you believe God to be.
But, sorry.
So that I think we should probably keep our questions a little shorter, without any setup. If it's possible to do it without a setup, to just get right to your we've got a little longer lines. People are lining up, so is that a good enough?
You can go
now?
to the back, and if we have time, you can ask her more.
Well,
yeah.
The reason that I asked it was because you were suggesting in laws that could create the same way God could create with no planner behind it. And I was just really wondering how exactly you could justify that belief. It's basically on faith.
Yes, exactly. It's just we're asserting here's a possible explanation that we've essentially made up, which is from the atheist perspective, the same thing the theist is doing. Here's a possible explanation we've made up, which is a God, and he does it because it's his nature. We can just say the same thing, well, here's a possible explanation.
Except for they have the individuals who have had the experience with God, which you dismiss as not.
Right.
We're going to let Tom have the last
Sure.
word on this, and then we got to go
Yeah.
to try to get as many questions as possible.
Experience doesn't give us a way to differentiate between what's imaginary and real. And so the fact that someone has an experience of something, just like the fact that people have experience of UFOs, isn't evidence that UFOs exist. We don't believe people because they had an experience of UFOs, or that there's lots of experiences of UFOs, because we have thousands of eyewitness testimonies of Bigfoot, and tens of thousands of the Loch Ness Monster, and hundreds of thousands of homeopathy and magic, and millions of ghosts, and hundreds of millions of Hindu miracles. The fact that lots of people have personal experiences isn't something we go off of to judge whether or not something is true or whether it exists.
I just want to thank both of you guys for coming out today, and especially for Tom being able to come out and into a church, probably something that is a little discomforting in certain ways, so I really appreciate that. And at the very end of your talk, you had stated that you wanted evidence. So this question is actually for both of you. What is evidence? And on top of that, what kind of evidence would it take to be able to change your mind completely about what you believe? So for instance, for you to become an atheist, and then also for you to be able to possibly become a Christian. So.
Yeah, I'll start with that. So evidence for me is future testable predictions. Like there are infinitely many ways to explain anything. Like if a cup falls over, maybe it was the wind, maybe someone bumped the table, maybe it was a mouse or a squirrel or a bird. But the good explanation, the best explanation, is one that can predict what we're going to see that we haven't seen yet. So We can say, well, if I think it was a mouse, and if it was a mouse, we're going to find mouse droppings around the cup. And then if we look and we find them, that's a good reason to believe that that explanation is better than the other explanations that couldn't predict it. So in the case of a God, if you can say, if there is a God and I do a prayer or something and this prayer will result in a gold brick in front of me, that's evidence. Now, of course, it's not conclusive, but it is evidence. And what would convince me completely? Well, as far as I know, all powerful, you can't really justify that. Because even if I saw God and saw him create a million universes, that million is still 0% of infinity. So if I was going to be convinced that he's infinitely powerful, I have no idea what evidence that would create. But I could believe there is a God. I could believe it's Yahweh. If we could give it a time travel and see Jesus rise from the dead, that's good evidence of Jesus. There's lots of things you can show, but the omnis, I'm not sure anything could convince me he's all powerful.
So for me, evidence, quite simply, without getting too technical about it, is just good reason to believe something. So I think that there's different categories of that. There's different ways of thinking about that. There's even different kinds of reasoning and logic, like abductive reasoning or different arguments. I'm really into formal arguments, whether there's something physical or something more abstract. For me, it's an interesting question, what would change my mind, because I have a properly basic belief in God. So it's something that's grounded in my experience in a deeper way than my senses. So it's not something that I saw God or I felt the presence of God. It's something that I believe as much as I believe that I exist, that I can think. So with that properly basic belief being grounded in something that I feel connected to God in a way that supersedes all things, I'm not saying it's exempt from a defeater. If a defeater were presented to me that showed me, clearly polytheism is true.
If we found Jesus' body.
Yeah, if we found Jesus' body and we knew that it was Jesus' body and there was no, I don't have any idea how we could create that scenario. But really, I will say that you could present a defeater to my properly basic belief, and then I would have to forego it. And actually, that's what I wanted when I was a young Christian. I came from a background, I wasn't raised Christian. Around age 18 to 20, I got into a lot of drug problems. I was a tattoo artist, and when I became a Christian, there was this big pressure to well, you can't do this, and you can't do that, and you got to give up this, and I was really ornery about it, and I was the biggest problem at Bible studies with my questions. And there was a short period in my life where I wanted to dismantle my own faith, so I searched for the defeaters. In my own experience, all I received was more reinforcement of that belief, which really annoyed me at the time. So yeah, great question.
Thank you, guys.
Don't know what it'd be.
So my question is for Tom. Assuming that you're concerned with being consistent in your worldview, that is, everything logically fits together and makes sense. I'm assuming you affirm determinism, since I would assume you are a naturalist. Do you believe that there's objective meaning to your life?
Yes, I am a determinist, and I do believe in objective meaning, and you don't need to have free will to have that. From the atheist standpoint, meaning doesn't need to be given from some kind of magical source outside. We believe in objective morality, just like we believe in meaning and all those other things, even without a God. So yes, I am a determinist, because I don't know what it would mean for there. As far as I know, every action you do is either done for reasons, in which case it's determined by those reasons, or it's done for no reason, in which case it's random, and those are the only two possibilities. There's no way to escape that dichotomy. So either you got determinism or randomness, and it's one of those two, and there's no way to get free will.
Question for Tom. I was wondering how your epistemology accords with historiography, or where they intersect. Because, as you already well know, logical positivists had a devil of a time with future testable predictions happening in history. You just simply can't do them. So, for example, I can think of a dozen or so possible conspiracy theories for how Abraham Lincoln was assassinated or how he died. And I can even think of very simple ones, such as he slipped on a banana peel in Peoria, Illinois. How does your epistemology accord for very simple conspiracy theories as opposed to very complex ones that, Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Right, so simplicity is usually a big one. Occam's razor, go with that one. But I'm not a logical positivist, so that was pretty well defeated a long time ago. But my position on historical evidence is the consensus in philosophy or in history is that most biblical scholars and historians hold to it that the study of miracle claims lies outside of the bounds of a historian acting with their professional capacity, which is a quote from Michael Licona in one of his papers, Historians of Miracle Claims. Essentially, history can't adjudicate new things that we haven't discovered yet. So if I told you I saw a dog, that would be reasonable to believe. If I told you I saw a unicorn, that would not be reasonable to believe. The difference between these two claims is that dogs have an implicit empirical basis. There's lots of things about dogs that we can demonstrate today, like their fur, chemical composition, makeup, how to train them, what they're allergic to. None of that exists for unicorns. And just like it would be reasonable for you to believe my testimony I saw a dog, and not my testimony of a unicorn, the same thing applies to historical testimony. So it's reasonable to believe historical testimony that there was a guy named Abraham Lincoln who was shot in a theater. It's not reasonable to believe historical testimony of miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, or UFOs. So most historiographers grant things that we can demonstrate or have some basis in empirical reality, but they don't grant things which do not, which is essentially miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, and UFOs. Hey, Jeremy, how's it going?
Good, how about you?
Pretty good.
Whoa, wow.
They're both from the same state.
Yeah, Jeremy Lynch, I'm friends with both of these guys. I'm Minnesota repping with Tom, but go Packers.
Boo!
All right, anyway, question, quick. So for the cosmological argument, that's a big argument we talked about. Are there any potential significant differences for how that argument could explain, say, a theistic conclusion versus a non-theistic conclusion, let's say naturalistic pantheism? In other words, is there something that would make us lean a little bit towards one way versus the other in regards to that argument? For both people.
No, strictly the three premises that are presented in the original Kalam do not. They don't say anything about a God. They just say anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. The universe has a cause. Now, there's three more premises which are added by more modern philosophers like William Lane Craig, where he says the premises presented by Stephen about only minds and abstract objects can be non-material or exist outside of space and time. Now, of course, those are essentially just rejected wholesale by most philosophers because we have no evidence of minds existing outside of space and time. There's just nothing of that for the most part. So if those were valid and sound, then yes, but they're not. So no.
Rejected wholesale by philosophers is a pretty strong statement. I'm going to give just a solid disagree on that. I think, again, saying X amount of philosophers think this about something is not addressing the argument itself. I think that causality and agency are necessary. That's why a mind is a better candidate than an abstract object. So, yeah, just easy answer.
Thank you.
Hi, guys. This one's for Tom, too, Stephen. I'm sorry.
I'm really lonely up here, guys.
So, Tom, Stephen gave you a pass on it earlier, but the thing that kept hitting me that you were saying this evening was comparing my ability to do whatever I want to do with slavery. Now, I have children. I've raised children, and for a large portion of their life, they were not allowed to do whatever they want to do, and that would not be considered slavery. I was making decisions for the best interest of my children at the time. When they reached an age where they could make their own decisions, I allowed them to move forward with that. And no one would consider me a slave owner at that time, except my children, of course, when they were mowing the lawn, doing the laundry. So that it isn't really a refutation of what you're saying. My thought really was to let you know that when you're using that argument, that's what came to my mind was, yes, I could consider it slavery in some cases, but parenting in others.
Right. So in my case, it would be as long as you don't drown your children. There's justifications for why you give children those limitations, which is because you're teaching them something. Because if they don't learn it, they're going to have greater consequences later. So like, if they put their hand in the fire, you're like, no, don't do that, because the slap is better than the burn.
Right.
But if they could just be optional and turn off the burn, well, then there's no reason to slap them. So if you can make it optional, both the punishment and the consequence that you're trying to avoid, then there's no reason for the punishment.
But also, if I'm making s'mores with my children, it's a lot more fun to make it over the fire and tell them not to stick their hand in the fire than to make them in the microwave. So that's the argument that I'm making. So thank you, Tom.
Hi guys, how you doing? I just want to thank you again for coming out. This has been really great. Really appreciate this. Tom, I'm just going to go out on a limb, and I'm just going to tell you right away that I'm going to set you up. Okay, so this is much more of a statement than it is a question. So if I need to be cut off, just cut me off. Okay. Quickly. Okay. So I'm going to try and make a really quick case, and I'm just going to ask you a very pointed question. So my case is that you say you're knowledgeable about quantum physics.
Relatively.
Okay. That's good. Okay. So the dualistic nature of reality is that things are open until they're closed, right? And so
Particle wave duality.
I'm sorry?
Particle wave duality.
Correct, right. So my claim is that Psalm 19 says that the firmament declares the works of God, that the glory of God is seen in the creation. And if we can look at quantum physics and say that something is open until it's closed, and what makes the difference is that we observe it, kind of gives credence to the object of faith as a tangible thing. And so I bring this up to kind of point a question at you and say that, isn't it possible that the Bible in its entirety and every claim that it makes could possibly close the system for you and just say that if I would put my trust completely and wholeheartedly in the name, again, something tangible, the name of Jesus Christ and what he did, and Paul also makes that claim in the New Testament where he says, if Christ was raised from the dead, then everything has credence. If he was not raised from the dead, then nothing, all of our faith is worthless. And so there's a lot of really simple arguments in the Bible where it just makes the statement that says, if, Occam's razor, it's very simple, the simple gospel. And taking the Bible in its entirety can, I believe, for an individual, close that system. And there are perfectly good explanations for the problem of evil if it's taken in the entirety of Scripture. And so my only question, again, I told you I would set you up. My only question is that if you could put your faith in the name of Jesus Christ, could that close the circuit for you to say, yes, it's true? Because there is a definite and an indefinite, and what it takes is the object of faith.
Well, I've tried it. I mean, I was a devout Christian for 18 years of my life, so most of my life, or almost 18 years. And most atheists were the same way. I mean, atheists are usually people who have really sought and strived extremely difficultly, read the Bible many times, prayed over and over and over again, and completely devoted their lives to Jesus, and to find out it wasn't working, there wasn't anything there. So it's possible, anything's possible. But the majority of atheists would say, no, I've already done that, it didn't work.
Okay, thank you.
Would you agree that we got to have faster questions?
James, how long does
I
it
was
say?
about to cut that one off. So it is true. We want to keep it as fast as possible. I hate cutting in.
Less set up, just pure question, 10 seconds or less if you can. Really try to, because there's more people that want to ask questions, and then of course we have to wrap up the debate as well. So.
Hi guys, thank you very much. I just want to make an argument, and my question for you is if you agree or you do not agree. The argument is based on, I see like science versus theology, like the clash of the titans. So let's see if we can find a common ground in between theology and science. Let's say this book is the absolute truth. Nothing else apart of this book is the truth. So science is like a witness who start opening page by page, unfolding all the absolute truth, but little by little. We don't know anything yet, but science is pretty much unfolding this book till they finish and all the truth is known. So my question is, do you agree with my argument?
I would say no. I mean, science says there is essentially no such thing as absolute truth. Everything is tentative. Everything is provisional. Everything we could know could change in the future. We could be in the Matrix. We have no idea. Everything science does is just, this is the best we can do by making combinations of the things we can verify, and that's it, and we stop. It's very, very small. The things we can know with science are infinitesimal percentage of what's out there. So science doesn't make any claims about absolute truth, and that's why science and religion are incompatible in many ways. It's because science says, we need to get rid of this idea that we're going to get to the absolute truth, because nothing we know even qualifies or comes close, and religion says, we can know the absolute truth, it's this God. And that's why religion and science are in conflict, because science doesn't want to go beyond what we can demonstrate, and religion does.
Thank you. That's it. Emily has a hyper quick question she would like to ask.
I really hope it's hyper quick. I really hope this is hyper quick, so I'm going to get us back onto your problem with consent. That you said that, I want to create my own world, and he should give us the option to have consent. Okay, consent does not exactly imply ability, so you don't have the ability to create your own world, I'm guessing. So let's start with that premise. With that premise, with all that you have experienced up until now, with all the things in your future, for your life, do you consent to your life?
I do not consent to being forced to live here against my will. I do not consent to suffering. I do not consent to hunger. I do not consent to strife.
I'm not asking that. I'm asking if he gave you the option and you couldn't create your own world. I'm asking, with everything that you have experienced in this life, good and bad, and everything in the future, and only your life, because that's really all you have control of, would you consent to it?
I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it.
Okay. And then on the other side, if you did have, it's just the opposite. The opposite question is, if you could create your own world, because you can't create humans, because that would make a slave owner yourself, would you choose your world or his world?
I would choose my world for a second, for every second of every day. For example, you don't need to be able to create humans to be able to share a world with humans. Like, for example, if everyone has the right to create their own world, you can still go to someone else's world. You don't have to stay in your own. You can still voluntarily move there, even if you can't create humans. So there's not really a problem there. You can still spend time with other people. You can all collaborate and join a collective universe and make one together.
Thank you.
Okay. So this is for Tom. You took the stance that by definition, our existence, given the existence of the Christian God, is slavery. But the definition of slavery refers to humans owning humans. Humans owning lesser beings like animals generally isn't considered slavery. And the Christian God would be a greater being, so we would be lesser beings than him. How would you respond to that?
I would call that speciesism. I think that it's immoral to kill animals just like it's immoral to kill people. I think they're living beings and they should be respected. And I think that animal cruelty is terrible and wrong. And I think it is slavery to own animals and not without their consent. So I would call that speciesism.
Okay.
I watched him eat a burger today. All right. Next question.
Breaks this thing. You know how much I hate talking in front of people, Stephen.
Thank you.
You know that.
This is a big moment.
Oh yeah, I'm petrified right now. So Tom, I had a question for you. Sorry, Stephen, you get to be ignored again. For the whole evil and suffering thing, simple question for you. Have you ever gone through anything difficult in your life?
Nah. Of course, yeah.
Did you become a better person because of it?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Fair enough. And then my other thing for the slavery, and I'm going to be the weirdo in the group. I'm agnostic, so I'm not even anything close to either or whatever you guys are. I just kind of decide not to be ignorant enough to not believe there's something, because I definitely know I'm definitely not at the top of that food chain. But if you choose God, as Stephen has, is that then considered slavery still if you choose to follow him?
No, not if you choose to.
All right, that's all I had.
Good questions.
Super excited about being here tonight. I was looking forward to it all week. Tom, this is for you. So my father taught me right from wrong, yet I still made my own decisions, good or bad. It's my biological father I'm talking about. My father allowed me to have free will. My father made me mow the lawn, shovel the snow, chop wood, because I obeyed my father, yet I never felt like a slave. My father knows me better than anyone could ever know me. My biological father I'm talking about again. yet he can see the best and worst in me. My Father can predict with perfect accuracy poor decisions I make, and he's not supernatural. Yet, my Father's not surprised when I do wrong, but yet he's angry at the poor decision I made that he knew I would make. He's still angry. My Father did punish me for wrongdoings, and once he took it way too far. And he promised never to do it again. And he kept his promise. My Father loves me unconditionally, and I love my Father the same. Tom, if my Christian God does not exist, and I was simply created by my biological father, is my biological father evil?
If he created the world in such a way that you have to go through all that suffering, and he could have created a better world and didn't, and he didn't give you the option to go to that better world, then yeah, he's immoral, because he forced you into this world where he had to teach you all these things, whether you wanted to or not, and go through all of this suffering, when he could have just created a different kind of a world and given you the option to be like, nah, I don't want to experience all that.
But my question isn't
Hold on,
about
I'm so
the
sorry.
Christian God.
If it's to
my question is about my Father.
If it's just to clarify, okay.
Yes, the point is that if it's just your father and he can't create the world in any way, then he's just doing the best that he can, then no, he's not immoral. But if he can create the world a different way and he doesn't, then he's objectively immoral.
Okay.
So we have time for two really quick questions, and then we've got to wrap up.
You talked about suffering and it being optional, and I was wondering what you meant by optional and what makes it morally worse to choose it.
Well, it's the choice that's moral. So you having the choice to do it as opposed to being forced to do it without consent. It's obviously more moral that if you can choose it, then there's no problem there. But if you're forced to choose it and you have no choice, especially if you don't want it, that's obviously immoral. You can choose to suffer if you want to. There's no problem there. It's not immoral to choose to suffer. And people do choose to suffer. Like when you work out, you choose to suffer. When you choose to play video games that are really, really hard, you choose to suffer. You can choose to suffer for lots of reasons. But it should be optional. It shouldn't be forced.
Thank you. And one last question. Thank you.
If science says that there is absolutely no truth, why do you put all of your trust into something?
It says we can't know absolute truth. So there could be an absolute truth out there, but science doesn't tell us what it is. So science just gives us a good way to tell the difference between our imagination and what we experience about the world, what exists in reality. But it can't tell us, oh, this is absolute truth and we're done. It's always tentative and provisional. So it says this is what we can show so far, and we're going to put a question mark at the end of whether or not it's true with a capital T.
So if I could kind of reply to that, when somebody says, you know, I'm going to just stick with science, that's all I've got, but it won't tell me what's absolutely true, but that's the best we've got. You know, the obvious question to ask there is that absolutely true? I think when it comes to agnosticism, not just about God, but about anything, that there's two types of agnostics. There's the soft agnostic who simply admits ignorance. They say, I don't know the answer, and that's it. And then there's the hard agnostic, which is a really untenable or at least very difficult position to hold, which is simply to say there is no truth or the truth cannot be known. Not only do I know, not only is it true that I don't know it, but I know that you don't know it. What's difficult about that position is you somehow have to be in the position where you have access to what they know in order to claim that they don't have the answers. To me, that's impossible. I have no idea what any of you know or think or have experienced for me to be so bold as to say you couldn't possibly have the answers for the big questions that all of humanity has. That's a leap of faith that I just can't make.
Want to let everyone know that both of the speakers have their links in the video, and as mentioned at the start of the debate, we would love for you to continue learning about these topics, as this is hopefully just a first stepping stone or one of many others in the future. So thank you all very much for coming out tonight, and we hope you have a great night. Thank you very much to Mill City Church. a huge thanks to Mill City Church for hosting and letting us use their equipment and everything just completely generously. We really appreciate everything.